Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Obito Sensei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1. Introduction. Team 7. Irika Umino's voice rang clearly through the classroom, and every newly appointed genin in it found themselves sitting up a little straighter. Their teacher was coming to the end of the team selection. Anyone left would probably be picked soon. Sakura Harino, a pink-haired girl sitting in the second farthest back row, perked up, looking around. Her brow scrunched as she tried to figure out who her teammates could be. She turned her head, her short hair shifting slightly with the motion as it struggled to escape the hitate keeping it secured behind her head. Sakura peered at the boy next to her, barely daring to look at him in her peripheral vision. Could she dare to hope? Sasuke Uchiha. The dark-eyed boy didn't react obviously. He didn't smile, or sigh, or close his eyes. But despite that, his shoulders shifted forward slightly, his clasped hands coming up farther in front of his face. There was a palatable sense of resignation, with a hint of relief. He stared straight ahead and slightly below him, at the back of the head of the boy sitting in front of him. Then, he let a slight grin appear on his face. And Naruto Namikaze. The Hokage's son turned around and looked straight into Sasuke's eyes. If Sasuke's grin was a glimmer of light crossing his face, then Naruto's was the sun itself. The blonde wiggled his eyebrows. Called it. You really think that's a good idea? The Hokage shifted. You're the only one I trust to do it. I'm flattered, Sensei, believe me. The man addressing the Hokage shifted, idly twisting his collar between two fingers. He spoke, his voice careful. But I don't think I'll be able to give everyone on the team enough attention. Sasuke and Naruto are both going to need watching, and the Harino girl. Her parents are somewhat accomplished, and her teachers say she really pulled herself together this year, but on a team like that. He shook his head. Someone is going to get the shorter end of the stick. Minato Namikaze smiled, lighting up the room. Don't worry about that. I'm gonna be giving Naruto some pointers anyway. A little graduation present. The man raised an eyebrow. You're going to teach him that? The Hokage shrugged. He won't stop bugging me. I figure the first time it knocks him on his ass will teach him a little humility. Team 7's sensei snorted. I doubt it. Knowing him, he'll have it down by the end of the month, and then his head will just be even bigger. Minato laughed. Probably. But it'll be worth a shot, I think. He grew serious for a moment. I'm counting on you, you know. Naruto, he's got the will of fire, I know it. And he'll lay his life down for his friends the minute he needs to, especially for Sasuke. But the rest of the Hokage's sentence went unsaid, as the blonde stared off into the distance. There was a moment of silence. You know that they've been conspiring about Itachi again? The other man asked, trying to distract his teacher. Minato nodded, his lips set in a flat line. Sasuke's become a little fixated lately, the man continued. The closer to graduation he's gotten, the more focused he's become. He's not ready yet. In contrast to his normal self, the Hokage sounded unusually sober. The man snorted, making a minute adjustment to his forehead protector to hide his quick tick. I doubt anyone will be ready for quite a while, Sensei. Even you. Would have turned out differently if Kushina hadn't been there, Minato muttered, finally managing to regain his humor. The other man smiled. He and his teacher had had this discussion too many times to count already, and Minato had always fallen back on that argument. Yeah. That's why she was so pissed you didn't go after him, he joked. The Hokage sighed. Doesn't matter anymore, he said. Listen. His voice was now completely serious again. Someone needs to get Naruto into line. He's got the foundations, but you're the best person to finish the job. And I know for a fact you'll be able to keep Sasuke under control. And Sakura. Focus training on her. The other two can manage for now. She's got fantastic chakra control for her age. Work on that, genjutsu, evasion, speed training. I don't doubt you have some tricks to teach her. I don't know. Sounds like Shisui would have been better. And he's dead, the Hokage cut him off. You're the best option. I don't like that. Get used to it. The office was silent once more. Finally, the other man sighed. All right. But someone is going to regret this. Minato smiled. Maybe. But it'll certainly be fun to watch. The man chuckled. So who do you think'll be our sensei? Naruto was sitting on top of one of the lecture tables, his legs tucked slightly in and his arms cast over them. He idly scratched his nose with one hand. Sasuke shrugged. Asuma, maybe. He didn't sound like he was very interested in the conversation, leaning against the window and looking out over the village, but Naruto knew that if he wasn't interested, then he wouldn't participate in the first place. That was how Sasuke approached everything, directly. What? The old man's son? Naruto asked. Maybe, Sasuke shrugged. He's a Sarutobi, so he's probably got fire jutsu. But he's also got a wind affinity, so he could help you out. And he's a Hokage's son. I bet your dad would find that pretty funny. Naruto pulled a face. Sakura just watched the conversation, afraid to step in. She wasn't sure if she was apprehensive or ecstatic. Mostly, she was quiet. Being on a team with Sasuke had been her dream ever since she'd first met him, all those years ago. He was handsome, respectful, and polite. And though there was a kind of coldness in him, a suppressed sense of ambivalence to what happened around him, it just made him more appealing. But Sakura was barely 13, she didn't really understand why that was. Naruto, on the other hand. Sakura was somewhat intimidated by him. The son of Minato Namikaze, the Yondaime Hokage, and Kushina Uzumaki, one of Konoha's most famous kunoichi. He was brash and loud. He was also rather dumb, at least when it came to tests. His taijutsu was average, but not as impressive as Sasuke's. The same could be said for his ninjutsu. He'd barely managed to scrape together a successful clone jutsu for the test. His chakra control was fairly abysmal. But Naruto was the Hokage's son, and people said that he had been learning from his parents as soon as he could walk. He may have been book dumb, but she had heard that he already knew the basics of Fuinjutsu, something that Sakura had no working knowledge of. And he learned quickly. Sakura knew for a fact that he hadn't been able to use a basic bunshin 2 weeks ago. He'd only learned it for the test. What do you think, Sakura? Naruto turned to her, and she blinked and straightened up from her thinking pose. What? She asked, and then winced. Sorry. I wasn't listening. Who do you think our sensei's gonna be? Naruto asked patiently, staring at her. She didn't understand why he did that. Maybe he was looking at her forehead. Ino said tying her hair behind her head would make her look more like a ninja, but maybe she was just trying to sabotage her. But why would she? Sakura? Naruto asked, puzzled. You okay? Sakura shook her head, trying to clear it. Yeah. She bit her lip. Unlike Naruto and Sasuke, Sakura didn't know many of the Jonin who took students on after they were assigned teams. The only one she did personally was maybe Kurane-sensei. She suggested. The red-eyed woman was friends with her parents. She'd even taught Sakura a very basic genjutsu for hiding blemishes a year or so earlier. Naruto looked thoughtful. Maybe, he said. He gestured to Sasuke. She could help Sasuke out with his Sharingan. He laughed. And everyone knows I couldn't use genjutsu if my life depended on it. Sakura has good chakra control, Sasuke quietly suggested. Kurane would be a good match for her. Sakura blushed and lowered her head, secretly pleased that Sasuke had noticed anything about her. Naruto nodded. Yeah, he said. I dunno, though. Who knows who we'll end up getting stuck with? It might even be Dash. The room was filled with a bizarre noise. It sounded like water running over electrified stones, or a generator in the midst of heating up being dropped down an elevator shaft. Sakura stood up, staring around, trying to locate the source. Naruto's eyes went wide. Sasuke closed his, bringing one hand up towards his face. A hole opened in reality, a dark void, about the size of an eye, in the center of the room. A man swirled out of it. He wasn't very tall, only about 5'7". He wore a dark blue bodysuit, with a standard Jonin flak jacket over it. There was an impressively straight scar starting just below his left eye, running just past his mouth and under his chin. He wore steel arm guards, plain of ornamentation and covered in minute scratches and dents. There was a small sheathed blade sitting on the small of his back, set horizontally. His hitayate, tied around his forehead, was affixed to an orange cloth. Obito, Naruto finished, looking somewhere between constipated and excited. Obito Uchiha stared at his teacher's son, the next prodigy of his clan, and a kunoichi in training who was probably going to spend the next couple months far out of her league. He raised 2 fingers to his forehead, bumping them against his hitayate. Yo! Chapter 2. Fair warning. This chapter is a little violent. One misstep. I see. Obito spun around, watching the injured Iwanin rise from the ground. Kakashi turned with him, minutely wincing as another spike of pain from his destroyed eye struck him. Apparently, Kakashi's strike hadn't killed the man, his vest had stopped most of the blow from getting through. He staggered to his feet, still speaking. You two make a good team, but you're still just kids. The man smirked, blood leaking from the slash in his vest. And right now, you're right where I want you. He began to steadily run through hand signs. Obito's eyes went wide, he instinctively reached back and grabbed Rin's hand. Kakashi actually spared a moment to roll his remaining eye. Doton, Iwaido Kyuzushi. The man declared, slamming his hand onto the stone floor of the artificial dome of boulders. There was a rumbling that Obito felt in his bones, and the ceiling shuddered. A single stone slipped from the press of rocks, dust, and powder coming with it. A moment later, dozens of stones began to follow it. The stone shinobi turned and ran. Go! Kakashi yelled, taking off into a pained sprint. Get to the exit. The whole thing is coming down. Obito and Rin broke into a dead run, pulling level with their teammate as the dome shattered and dust filled the air. The din was incredible. Obito had never heard something so loud in his life. It was as if the earth itself was roaring in rage, doing its best to crush them under tons of stone and rubble. Pebbles bounced off his head, they stung terribly, but he couldn't afford to slow down, or to shield himself. He focused everything on pumping his arms, increasing his speed. Rin was doing the same, as was Kakashi. Then, Obito looked up, and the world changed forever. A stone fell from the ceiling, headed right for Kakashi's head. If it fell without interruption, it would smash into the silver-haired boy, sending him to the floor in a dazed heap. He would be vulnerable to the rest of the sizable boulders raining down. To Obito, with his Sharingan, the rock seemed to descend in slow motion. He could see every detail of it perfectly, every fissure, crack, the pattern of dust on the underside. His decision about his course of action was far quicker than the stone. He lunged forward, trying to divert the rock from Kakashi's head. He succeeded, it struck his left arm with a sickening crunch, and white fire filled that side of his body. Rin snapped her head towards him, her expression horrified, and Obito spared her a shaky grin. The stone hadn't hit Kakashi in the head, so Obito considered it a victory, even if he was positive he'd just broken his arm. Unfortunately, the pain of his new injury, plus the distraction of Rin's eyes, made Obito trip right over his own feet as a smaller stone struck him in the ankle. He hit the floor hard and bounced, sending another tidal wave of boiling agony racing down his arm. Obito screamed. He couldn't help himself. Kakashi turned, his remaining eye wide. If Obito's vision hadn't been blurred from the pain in his arm, he would have seen Kakashi dart his eye upwards for a moment before he rushed forward. The Jonin seized Obito by his unbroken arm, and heaved him backwards, towards Rin. The Uchiha spun in midair, facing back towards Kakashi. This time, no matter how acutely the Sharingan rendered the scene, there was nothing he could do but scream in horror as he saw the massive boulder that had been about to fall on him slam Kakashi to the ground. The impact was thunderous, the remains of the dome shook, and gravel and dust filled the air, blinding both Obito and Rin. He yelled, unwilling to believe what he had just seen. Rin echoed his cry. Kakashi! He hit the ground, and the pain in his arm exploded. Obito blacked out. He came to suddenly. One moment he was unconscious, the next, fully aware. Obito almost wished he wasn't. His arm felt horrific, like someone had jammed a bundle of kunao inside it, and then tossed him off the Hokage monument for good measure. He hissed, doing his best not to jostle it as he slowly pulled himself up. He cast his eyes around, the Sharingan whirling. Where was Rin? And Kakashi? He spun about frantically, trying to locate his teammate. Even with his new eyes, he could barely see through all the debris. Where had Kakashi fallen? Or Rin? He couldn't find them anywhere. Obito. He heard the muffled gasp to his left, and jerked towards it, eyes wide. He staggered forward, gritting his teeth and ignoring the pain in his arm. There was a pile of smaller stones, each only about the size of his hand. The voice had come from it. He reached it and bent down, his functional arm slowly moving forward. It was trembling. Obito grasped one of the stones on top of the pile, and slowly pulled it off. Rin's chocolate brown eyes stared up at him, a trail of blood running between them. He yelped, and began scrabbling at the stones, pulling more and more of them off his teammate. After a couple seconds, her form became clear, hunched over, and shaking. The stones had formed a sort of cairn around her. Aside from a multitude of bruises and a nasty cut on her scalp, she didn't look seriously hurt. Rin. Obito whispered. She didn't look away from him. Her breath was coming too quickly, she was hyperventilating. Obito? She asked. Her gaze shifted to his side. Your arm. She stumbled forward, falling to her knees. Obito bent down, unsure of what to do. He settled for grabbing her hand. Rin. It's fine. I'm okay. It's not as. He looked over, and gulped. His left arm hung limply, a shard of bone sticking out of the elbow. He couldn't feel it at all. He was pretty sure that wasn't good. Obito's mouth was suddenly dry, but he tried to not let it show. It's not as bad as it looks, he finished, doing his best to grin. Rin just stared up at him in disbelief. He heard a stone shift in the distance. The fragile balance the stones had achieved would likely be short-lived. Rin, he said again. Where's Dash? Kakashi. She suddenly said, scrambling to her feet. Where is he? There was a rock Dash. I know, Obito said. I've been looking for him. But Dash. Obito. The croak echoed throughout the collapsed cave. Rin. Obito and Rin both turned towards the voice. Kakashi. Rin gasped. They both limped towards the sound of their teammate. A stone towered over them, blocking their path. They walked around it, Obito desperately trying to suppress the agony in his arm. They found Kakashi on the other side, sprawled out on the floor, facing up towards the ceiling. His abdomen, and everything below it, was pinned beneath the boulder. Blood spread in a steadily widening pool around him. He stared up at Obito with a dark, clear eye. Obito stared back, horrified. Rin fell to her knees at his side, her hands clamping over her mouth. Tears leaked from her eyes. Good. You're okay, the other boy whispered. Obito's legs failed him. He joined Rin on his knees, clutching his broken arm to keep it from moving. Kakashi Dash. Rin hiccuped, unable to finish her sentence. The Haytake moved his oddly lucid eye to her. He smiled. Don't worry, Rin. There's nothing you can do. I can't even feel a thing down there. He vaguely gestured to his lower body, the movement of his arms halting and feeble. They barely got off the ground. It's totally crushed. At this point, all I can do is wait for the shock to finish me off. Don't talk like that. Obito hissed. We're gonna get you out of here. We're Team Awesome, remember? There's not way a rock like this is gonna dash. He choked, his words catching in his rapidly clenching throat. Kakashi just watched him with one calm eye. Sorry, Obito. But, this is the end for me. He closed his eye, but his breathing remained, though it grew more and more unsteady. His teammates just watched, mute. Tears began to leak from Obito's eyes as well. No. He shook his head, his voice steadily growing louder. No, It wasn't supposed to go like this. You're the captain, the Jonin. You're the one who's supposed to go become the big war hero. He lurched to his feet. You can't do this, Kakashi. I'm just the dead last. The worst Uchiha. You can't just leave dash. Obito shut his eyes tightly. Please, he whispered. Please, don't die. I don't have a choice, Obito, Kakashi said, every word a struggle. Obito made a desperate noise, but Kakashi cut him off. And besides, you've got your Sharingan now, with that you can dash. I was going to use it to help our team work. Obito yelled. I can't if you're dead, huh? Kakashi dash. Obito. Rin's quiet voice snapped the Uchiha out of his indignation. Her tears had ceased, and she watched him with dark but firm eyes. He stared at her, and then back at Kakashi. What was he doing? His teammate, his friend, was dying, and he was spending their last minutes together yelling at him. He bent back down, watching his team leader the whole time. Both of his arms were limp at his side. He couldn't stop his tears, like Rin had. She reached out, and took Kakashi's hand in her own. Obito hesitated, before mirroring the movement with Kakashi's other hand. They were silent for a moment. Kakashi weakly squeezed Obito's hand. Obito returned the favor. I'm glad, the Haytake said. That I'm dying like this. Neither of his teammates tried to interrupt him. I understand my father's choices now, I think. Doing anything for his team, even giving his life. Kakashi was silent for a moment. Obito stilled, worrying that he might have died. The fear was unfounded. Kakashi sighed. Rin. I'm sorry. The brown-haired girl sucked in a breath, before nodding, a small, sad smile on her face. And then. Obito. Why yeah. Obito said, trying not to sniffle. He could hear Kakashi trying not to smile. Bastard. 3 things to tell you. The Jonin's voice was fading fast. I'm listening, Kakashi, Obito promised. He wouldn't forget what his friend said to him for the rest of his life. You and Rin, look out for each other. You are, my team. I don't want anything to happen to you. Kakashi's mask was beginning to dampen, he was bleeding into it through his mouth. Protect each other. Obito nodded frantically, his lips set in a determined line. Second, you may not have gotten me a gift. Obito stiffened, while Kakashi continued, but I have one for you. Take my sword. Kakashi gasped, having more and more difficulty making his words clear. His voice was barely above a whisper. It was my father's. I don't want it to just lie in here with me. Get some of those guys, will you? Obito couldn't bring himself to say anything. Rin did for him. Of course, Kakashi, she said gently, squeezing his hand again. Last thing, Kakashi said. Obito had to bend in close, straining to hear him. Obito. I know, you can do it. You'll become the greatest of the Uchiha, the greatest ninja in Konoha. Kakashi's eye opened, but it didn't see anything. I know it. And then he went slack, his eye slumping closed once more, and his grip on Obito's and Rin's hands fell away. Kakashi Haytake was dead. Obito stared at the body. Rin closed her eyes, rocking back and forth and maintaining her grip on Kakashi's hand. The Uchiha took a deep, shuddering breath. His eyes caught fire. Not literally, fortunately. But the agonizing, steady burn in them emerged from nowhere, and he blinked, too stunned to care that it felt like his eyes were melting. He gave out a pained grunt, not looking away from Kakashi's sallow face. Rin opened her eyes and looked up at him. She gasped. Obito. Your eyes dash. Wadash. Obito raised his arm to his face, trying to scrub away his tears. He could feel them, his cheeks were getting wetter and wetter. His arm came back down smeared with blood. His eyes were bleeding. Both of them, sending trails of thick, sticky blood sliding down his cheeks. Obito stared at the blood on his arm in astonishment. He raised his hand, pressing around his face, feeling the blood. His eyes kept burning. But it no longer felt like molten copper was circulating throughout his head, filling it with fire. Instead, the flames had become a solid buzzing, warming his head. It felt like the Sharingan, but heavier. More cloying. It felt good. Obito bent forward, undoing the clasp on Kakashi's short blade. He pulled it from the dead boy's back, before tossing the sheath aside and carrying just the blade. He slowly stood up, his legs trembling. Rin watched him with wide eyes. "Where are you going?" she asked. Obito dash. "I'm going to go get that bastard," Obito hissed. "He's the one who did this to Kakashi. I'm going to make him pay." "Obito, you can't," Rin said. "Your arm, your eyes, just wait for Sensei. Please." Obito shook his head. "He'll take too long. And there are gonna be more of them. I have to do this now." He turned around, but Rin reached out and grabbed his arm, not rising from her knees. "At least let me help your arm," she said, looking at him with imploring eyes. Obito looked at her, his Sharingan still. He swallowed, unable to keep the fear swallowing him up out of his voice. "Okay." Rin rose and bent forward, running her glowing green hands over Obito's arm. He shivered at the sensation. She bit her lip. "Okay," she said steadily. "I've set the bone. But you won't be able to use it." Obito smiled grimly. "I won't need it." He turned and strode towards where light peeked through the shattered dome of stone, headed for the outside world. "Stay with Kakashi. Protect his body. Obito." He stopped for the last time, not turning around. "Please come back." He nodded, and left the tomb. "So you're still alive, huh?" Obito didn't respond to the bushy-haired ninja staring up at him with an amused glint in his eyes. He just glared back, his broken arm rigid at his side, his grip on Kakashi's tanto turning his fingers white. He stood on top of the former dome, it had been reduced to so much piled rubble. He'd managed to worm his way to the top of it, only to find his teammate's murderer sitting at the base, sipping from a canteen. Obito's arm was still unusable, hand signs were out of the question. All he had was his new sword, and his new eyes. The stone Jonin shook his head. "How stubborn. But it doesn't matter. You're still just a kid." He smiled. "And crying, too. Tears of blood, how dramatic." Obito shifted a foot back, raising his sword. The Iwanin cocked his head, twin steel blades sliding from his forearm wrappings. "Come on then, brat. Let's finish this." Obito didn't attack. Not right away. Instead, he continued to glare, his Sharingan, and the Tomo in it, whirling rapidly. Faster. Faster. They began to spiral inward, meeting at the pupil. The rotation began to slow, then reverse, but as the Tomo pulled away, they seemed to pull the pupil with them, into their rotation. A three-point figure formed, a triangle without sides, with dashes of black moving from each point, like the tail of a comet. The pupil became a red dot at the center of the design. The Iwa Jonin, a man named Kako who delighted in simple things like torture, murder, and burying men alive, blinked. His eyes, "That's no ordinary Sharingan." Obito spoke quietly. His voice was cold, and it trembled. "You killed my friend." He blinked heavily, and the new Sharingan design began to spiral about again. "You killed Kakashi." Obito roared. And then he leapt off the stone tomb, sword held high. Kako smirked, and raised his blades to meet him. To Obito, the man seemed to be moving in slow motion. He could see his every movement. He could see what he intended to do, before he did it. He looked so clumsy. Like he was flailing underwater. So this was the power of the Sharingan. No wonder his clan could be so arrogant. Obito watched the man's swords come up. If he simply went on falling, he would be impaled. He couldn't let that happen. If he died here, then so would Rin. And Rin would not die. Obito's arm shot out, and he flung his tanto at the man, sending it end over end. Kako's eyes widened, and he altered the path of his blades, crossing them in front of his chest. The former sword of the White Fang crashed into it, and was deflected into the soil. Obito landed on the still crossed blades a moment later, the steel digging into but not cutting through his thick sandals. Chakra kept his balance steady for the 1 second that the IWA ninja had to look at the child perched on his crossed blades. On any other day, Obito would have considered his expression hilarious. But today, all he felt was dreadfully cold anger. The Uchiha punched the man in the face. Hard. Kako slid back, his face bloodied. Obito fell to the ground, landing painfully on his tailbone and gritting his teeth. He rolled backwards, his hand grasping for his new sword, and came back to his feet with it in hand. NGGH. The Jonin spat out a bloodied tooth. What the hell was Dash? Obito charged him. He was done talking. The Tonto came around, trailing Silver Chakra, and suddenly Kako was too busy desperately defending himself. Steel clanged on steel as Obito pushed the older ninja back across the clearing. His recently broken arm hung slack at his side, but he didn't need it. The Sharingan allowed him to redirect the other man's strikes before they even happened. 2 blades flashed out in a desperate uppercut, trying to knock Obito's guard up, but the Uchiha didn't attempt to meet the strike. Instead, he dropped his sword and spun back. Kako stared as Obito's blade fell between his 2 extended ones, both of them missing it in its owner completely. He had overextended himself, there was too much power behind his swing. Both of his arms were up, leaving his body open. Obito finished his spin. His hand darted out and caught the Tonto as it fell. He pushed forward, and buried it up to its hilt in the Jonin's chest. The IWA nin stumbled back, dragging the Tonto from Obito's hand. He stared at the smaller boy in astonishment. Obito looked back fearlessly. The man chuckled. Heh. Figures. Blood splashed across his jacket and chin as he spoke, pouring from his mouth. All I put up with, and a little punk like you offs me. He sank to his knees. Obito walked towards him, wary, but the dying Jonin made no move. He grabbed the handle of the Tonto. Joke's on the you, though, the man said, and Obito looked at him dispassionately. I'm not alone. Obito's Sharingan widened, and he yanked the sword from the man's chest, spinning to the left. He was too slow. A foot hammered into his broken arm, and he flew back, bouncing along the grass. A broken scream of pain tore itself out of him. He slid to a stop and stared back at where he'd come from. His arm flared in agony, and his vision blurred, but that didn't matter. IWA ninja filled the field. There were more than a dozen of them, all tall, heavy-set men. Some were twice Obito's height, and all of them were certainly heavier. They wore standard flak vests, denoting them as Chunin. They had probably been the Jonin's subordinates. And they were all staring at him, with hate-filled eyes. Kako Teiku. One of the younger men was shaking the Jonin that Obito had stabbed, trying to slow the bleeding from the sizable wound in his chest. He was failing. But the slender man didn't seem to care. He was watching Obito with a spiteful smile. He spoke up, and all of the stone ninja imperceptivity shifted as they listened to him. Listen up. He rasped. That brat's killed me. But he's got something we need. Forget the information. He leveled a finger at Obito, who shook as another flash of agony shot up his arm, making his heart jump a beat. He's got a fully formed Sharingan. Take it, and the village will owe you a debt. He smiled fully, revealing his blood-stained teeth, and then sank back, falling to the ground. Obito knew that the man was dead, or would be in a moment. And that he would probably soon be joining him soon. The IWA nin roared together, and charged. Obito watched them approach with whirling eyes, his grip tightening once more on his Tonto. He took a deep breath. The first ninja to reach Obito had a snarl on his face and a kunai clenched in each of his fists. He swept them in towards the boy's chest, attempting to gut him. The smaller Uchiha didn't give him a chance. The Tonto swept out, knocking one of the kunai off course, and he spun between the man guard, putting his back to him. The man made to grab him, but the Tonto was already shooting back, burying itself in his gut. The taller ninja grunted in pain, and then fell as Obito ripped the sword upwards, opening a wound across the whole of the man's abdomen. Something slippery fell from the man, who keeled over. Obito didn't spare him a glance. There were still over a dozen ninja surrounding him. The next attack came more quickly, one man from in front of him, and another to his side. The one approaching from the front jumped into a roundhouse kick. Obito ducked it, swinging his tanto up to take off the Iwanin's foot. But a trio of shuriken, thrown by the man to his side, leapt into his peripheral vision, and he twisted, interpreting the tanto between him and them. The new angle gave him just enough time to realize that another enemy was approaching him from behind before the man tackled him to the ground. For the third time that day, Obito hit the ground like a sack of bricks. He tried to roll away, but the enemy ninja had him pinned. The man loomed over him, a tanto of his own held in his hand. Obito made to raise his, and someone stomped down on his hand, hard. The feeling of his fingers breaking was barely worse than the sound they made as they did. The White Fang's sword fell from his ruined fingers. Obito glared up at the man on top of him, who leered down. "Nice try, kid." But there was no way this would go any other way. He growled, swinging the blade down. Obito snarled. Time stopped. Obito watched his death coming for his throat, a foot and a half of dirted steel. His death, and Rin's death. These men had killed Kakashi. These men were about to kill him. And then they would kill Rin. Kill Rin. Kill Rin. His eyes went wide, the Sharingan was whirling so fast the 3 points seemed to form on continuous circle. Obito's left eye strained, a trickle of blood ran from it, down the side of his face. The tanto disappeared. The man swiped his empty hand across Obito's throat, and then suddenly stopped. He stared in astonishment at where his blade had been a second ago, and then at the boy under him. What? Obito kicked him in the back of the head. He toppled forward, and the young Uchiha surged forward, breaking the older man's nose with a headbutt. The Iwanin reeled back, and Obito scrambled back to his feet. His eyes burned. But it was good. He bared his teeth, his lips pulling back into something that by no means could be called a smile. The blood on his face began to dry. Even with both of his hands useless, even with his head burning, he felt invincible. "Kman!" He yelled to the rest of the stone ninja, who were watching him. A couple of them looked confused, the rest, just angry. But no matter how they looked, they all obliged him, rushing in. Obito moved. Two men found themselves with concussions before they could blink. The small Uchiha leapt from one to the other's head, flooring them with bone-shattering kicks. A man jumped high into the air, falling like a meteor armed with a sword, and Obito glanced up at him. His eye bled again. The Iwanin's katana vanished, and he had just enough time to look enraged before Obito nailed him in the chin with a powerful kick, snapping his head up. The man hit the ground limply, dead or unconscious. Obito didn't care. Enough. Obito heard the yell behind him and spun, sweeping a leg low. He turned just in time to find a kunai inches from his forehead. No. His right eye quivered. A drop of blood leaked from it. The kunai hit him in the forehead. And went straight through. A man behind Obito screamed briefly as the knife struck him in the throat. He gurgled as he fell, scrabbling at the weapon's hilt. Obito didn't give himself any time to wonder what had allowed him to escape an impromptu lobotomy. Nor did he give any of the other ninja any time to figure out what the hell they had just seen. He rushed forward. His eyes tingled, and the tanto that had disappeared less than a minute earlier fell into existence right in front of his face. He caught it in his teeth. The man he was rushing, who had thrown the kunai, stumbled back, eyes wide. Obito leapt on top of him, bearing him to the ground under his knees, and drove the tanto up to its hilt into the man's jaw, and out through the top of his head. Blood splattered across Obito's face, mingling with what had come from his eyes, but he ignored its warmth. The rest of the Iwanin watched, horrified, as he rose from the body of the man he had just killed. Bending slightly, he took a kunai from the man's pouch. His broken fingers were barely able to lift it, but he ignored their protests. He turned his head to the side and opened a pouch on his shoulder with his teeth. A spool of ninja wire lay within, and he bit down on it and teased it out. "What are you just standing around for?" One of the older-looking men yelled as Obito raised his broken hand to his face, the knife clutched in it. "Kill him." "Kunai, Senbon, shuriken, and several more esoteric weapons appeared in the hands of the stone shinobi. They all threw them at the same unspoken moment. Obito ignored them. The rain of steel and needles passed through him, not even ruffling his clothes with their passing. Many of the Iwanin had to dive out of the way of their comrades' weapons. One took a shuriken to the knee, another a kunai through the hand. Obito began tying the ninja wire around his hands with his teeth, securing the kunai there. As the Iwanin watched in astonishment and fear, he finished. His right hand came back down, the kunai was affixed to it, held in place by the wire wrapped around his fingers. "What the hell are you?" the one whose hand had been impaled by a kunai said. Obito glared at him, and the man's head twisted out of existence. He didn't have time to scream before it vanished, and his body fell to the soil, copiously spurting blood from his empty neck. More liquid trickled from the Uchiha's left eye, but he paid it no mind. Every single man present took several steps back. One turned and ran. "What am I?" Obito asked, casting more glares around. None of them were as lethal as the last one had been. "I am the least of the Uchiha. I'm Obito." He raised his hand, and the kunai with it. "I'm the Yellow Flash's student." There was a hissed exclamation from the same man who had ordered the projectile barrage moments before, and most of the shinobi shared meaningful looks. Two men dropped their weapons, their fingers unable to hold them. Obito took a step forward. All of the other ninja took another step back. "And I am your death." He charged. Rin sat on the ground, watching Kakashi's body. She stroked his head, running her fingers through his hair, and looked out towards the entrance of the dome. She hadn't heard anything since Obito had left, aside from some brief yelling. She had no idea what was happening outside. But it had been more than 10 minutes, and she was starting to think that Obito wouldn't be coming back. She wasn't crying. She had resolved not to. But that didn't stop the occasional quiver of her lips, or the palpitation of her heartbeat. She'd lost both of her teammates in the same day, to the same man. And now, they were going to fail their mission, and more Konoha shinobi would die because of their own deaths. The sheer unfairness of the situation made her clench her hand. She stopped when she realized what it was doing to Kakashi's hair. She moved her hand to her knees, and then stood up. If she was going to die, she wanted to see Obito one last time before she did. And he might still be out there. She turned, before looking back at Kakashi's body. Rin sucked in a breath and whipped her head back around, closing her eyes tightly. Then, there was a near-silent rush of air from behind her. She turned back around, and found Minato Namikaze standing there. He stared at her, and then down at the body of his other student. Rin gasped. Minato just closed his eyes. "Oh. Kakashi," he whispered, bending down to check the silver-haired body. "Sensei," the girl murmured, stepping closer to him. He looked at her, and his face grew alarmed. He stepped forward, drawing her in. "I'm here. I'm here, Rin," he said. She looked up at him, unbelieving. The Yellow Flash smiled. Somehow, he made it look genuine. "It's okay." Rin burst into tears. He just wrapped his arms tighter around her. "Sensei," she cried. "I know. Rin, I know. But please, where's Obito?" His voice was dull. Minato normally sounded carelessly cheerful. Today was not a normal day. Rin just shook her head. Minato grabbed her shoulder, and bent down to her level. "Rin. Where is he?" he said patiently, looking into her eyes. "He's gone too." She burst out, gesturing wildly to the exit. "He left to fight the men who killed Kakashi. But he hasn't come back." She fell backwards, but Minato kept her from hitting the ground. Rin kept talking. "And he had a broken arm and his eyes were bleeding and he was such an idiot, and now cause I didn't stop him he's probably dead." She babbled, barely able to speak past her tears. Minato looked stricken. Rin tore herself out of his grip and stumbled to the floor, holding her head in her hands. "Rin," he said again, but he didn't seem to know what to follow it with. For a moment, the tomb was silent. Only Rin's weeping disturbed the quiet. For a moment. "Rin." The girl in question's head snapped up, her tears instantly ceasing. Minato stared as well, his eyes wide. Obito Uchiha stumbled into the shattered dome, covered head to toe in bright, fresh blood. His eyes were the same color, the Sharingan scanning everything. A broken kunai was wound to his right hand, the fingers of which were mangled by steel wire. His left arm hung completely limply, twisted in a manner that was wholly unnatural. He found his sensei first. A small smile broke out on his face, and he fell to his knees. Slowly, his eyes fell upon Rin, who stared back, mute. Obito sighed in relief. "You're okay," he muttered. And then he collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. Chapter 3. Trust. Sakura hit the ground hard. Her whole head jolted, and the world grew a bit darker. Her teeth ached. She was pretty sure her ankle was broken. She was only pretty sure because while there was a nauseating flare of pain, there wasn't the distinctive crack of bone. She managed to scramble to her feet, doing her best to ignore her aching back and throbbing arm. She could move, that meant that it wasn't broken, probably just sprained. Sprinting on it merely sent jolts of lightning up her leg, instead of filling the limb with cold fire. She hurtled through the forest, ignoring the pain that came with every step. Where was he? There was a rustling sound, and she jumped sideways, sure that he was back, that he was flinging himself towards her. At any moment. It was just a twig. A twig had fallen from her hair. Nothing. Nothing to worry about. She didn't know where her sensei was anymore. She'd lost him after the last brief exchange, he'd melted back into the leaves, and now she was apparently alone again. But that wasn't true, of course. Obito was out there somewhere, watching, waiting, and she had to get as far away from here as possible before he decided that he'd had enough of it and came after her again. How long had it been? 5 minutes? 10? How much longer was this going to last? Or was it ever going to end at all? Her hand tightened around the bells in her left hand, feeling the now warm metal reassuringly press into her palm. She'd kept them in her pouch until Obito had cut it off, now, she was forced to carry them. But at least they were all still there, she still had a chance. Unless Obito had been lying. Sakura stopped. No. Don't stop. She took off once more, fighting the shaking that racked her body. Stopping would be a bad idea. If she stopped, Obito would find her that much sooner. She kept running. But she couldn't stop the thoughts that her first one had unleashed. What if Obito had been lying? Had they ever really had a chance at being genin? He'd been after them relentlessly. Merciless and cold. That wasn't right. Unless, this had never been a test at all. Unless this whole charade was all. Her increasingly desperate and terrified thoughts were interrupted when she ran into something tall and unyielding and fell back, yelping in surprise and pain. Sakura hit the grass and sprawled, stunned. Had that been a wall? Whose idea was it to put a wall in the middle of the forest? She finally looked up, and her eyes went wide. The trembling that had plagued her intensified. Oh no! Obito stood over her, staring down with a complete lack of interest. His eyes were blank onyx, the Sharingan deactivated. His face was slack, there didn't seem to be a hint of life to him. No 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 no! Sakura scrambled backwards, before her hand bumped something. She turned her head. Sasuke was lying insensible on the ground behind her, his clothes rumpled and his face marred by an obvious bruise shaped like her sensei's shoe. Sakura didn't shriek. But only because she bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She whipped her head back around, the movement of a startled animal. Obito began slowly walking forward, his stride unhurried. Sakura just watched him. What could she do? She was just one genin. Not even a genin yet, probably never will be. What could she do against one of the elite of the village? Obito finally reached her and bent down, his knees sliding gracefully into a squat so his dead eyes lined up with hers. Sakura pressed herself farther back into Sasuke's unconscious body, hoping against hope that he would wake up and defend her. She couldn't do this. She wasn't special. Why was she here? Why was he doing this? He chose that moment to speak. Sakura, he said quietly, looking into her eyes without actually looking. Give them up. He extended one hand slowly, palm open and upward, obviously waiting for something to be dropped into it. The bells. He still wanted the bells. She stared at his hand, and then at him. He looked back patiently. Give me the bells, he said calmly. Give up. You'll pass, and they'll fail. That's the way of things. They'll be disappointed, but they should have been prepared for something like this. Sakura blinked. She wasn't strong enough. She wasn't ready to be on this kind of team, with the Hokage-san and the Uchiha's heir. She couldn't fight Obito. She couldn't defend her teammates. She should give up. Take the easy pass, and send her team back to the academy. Continue on herself. Her parents would be proud. And yet, who does he think we are? Did he think that she would just throw away Naruto and Sasuke's chances at being genin? That she would betray them like that? Sakura blinked again, but it wasn't the bewildered, defeated one from earlier returning for another round. Her bright green eyes sharpened. The hand holding her teammates' futures opened momentarily, 3 small balls of metal revealed momentarily, before tightening again into a white-knuckled fist. What could she do, though? She couldn't fight Obito. The last couple minutes had proven that without a doubt. She couldn't throw the bells away. Obito was far faster than her, he'd definitely retrieve them before she could. She had to get them out of hands. There was a way. Sakura felt stupid for even considering it, but at the moment, it seemed the best option. You want the bells, sensei? She muttered angrily, barely able to get the words past her quivering lips. Her whole body was shaking. She couldn't tell if it was fear or anger. Obito cocked his head. Give them up, Sakura. Please. I would prefer not to dash. And Sakura's hand shot up, stuffing all 3 bells in her mouth. Obito's eyes went wide, and he looked down at her as she swallowed with a little hesitation, gagging as they slid down her throat. Sakura coughed heavily, once, twice, and then glared up at her teacher, trembling in fear and anger. Kman. The voice wasn't real, wasn't out loud, but Obito could unmistakably see the message in her wide green eyes. Take them then. There was a moment of silence as Sakura panted and Obito stared. And then the Uchiha laughed. He sat up, unfolding out of his crouch, and scratched the back of his head. Well, he said, suppressing a laugh. That works, I guess. I'll go get Naruto, give him the good news. He turned and walked away, and left Sakura on the ground, staring at his back. She only had one thought in her head. What? About 20 minutes earlier, Sakura stared down at the bell in her hand, and then back up at her teacher. She began to mutter, before Naruto cut her off. The bell test? He asked, incredulous. He and Sasuke shared a glance. Obito, we know this. What's the point of dash? He knew about this test? How? His father was the Hokage. Of course he knew something like this. Well, the older man smiled warmly. First off, it's Obito Sensei now. Despite the smile, he managed to inject just enough mirthful threat into his voice to make Naruto's eyes go widen. The blonde boy took a half step back. Sasuke rolled his eyes, but didn't say anything. Sakura just watched the Hokage-san carefully. She was tired, and somewhat cold. It was too early in the morning to be doing this sort of thing. After Obito had appeared in the classroom, they'd all made their way to the roof. Basking in the warmth of the sun and enjoying the slight breeze that swept over the Hokage monument and down onto the academy, Sakura had felt some of her anxiety melt away. Even if her team was unlike any of the others, it was still a team, and she was part of it. That idea gave her a slight thrill. Obito had gone around and asked everyone why they were there. Their likes and dislikes, their hobbies, their ambitions. He'd been humoring her. She could tell, it was painfully obvious. Naruto and Sasuke were already close. They knew each other practically better than they knew themselves. Even their goals were aligned. Naruto had loudly boasted that he was going to steal my dad's hat if it's the last thing I do, at which Obito had given a wry smile, obviously enjoying a private joke. Sasuke had been more subdued. And thinking back to his proclamation still made Sakura feel cold in a way she didn't really understand. "I will restore the Uchiha to their former power," he'd said in a quiet voice, his hands crossed in front of his face. Obito had just watched him with careful eyes. But then, the handsome boy's features had sharpened, and his teeth had flashed in the midday sun, and suddenly Sakura didn't find him so handsome anymore. "But before I do that," he'd gritted out, "I have something else to attend to." Obito had simply given him a look. Sakura knew those kind of looks. The kind that screamed, "We'll be talking later." It was clear that there was something she didn't know about Sasuke. And that thought filled her with a curious combination of wariness and self-admonishment. Of course she didn't know everything about Sasuke. But Sakura had thought she'd somewhat understood him, and that flash of sharp bitterness he'd shown unnerved her because she'd never caught a glance of it before. Sasuke had never exactly been warm, but he'd never seemed bitter. Never seemed dangerous. But Sakura hadn't had time to figure that bitterness out because then it had been her turn. Obito had turned to her expectantly. So had Naruto, swiveling in her direction with a beaming grin shining on his face. Sasuke had only shifted slightly, but it was clear he was listening, at least. Sakura had stumbled. I am Sakura Harino. I like umbashi, and training, I guess," she'd said uncertainly. She had never especially enjoyed the more physical aspects of shinobi training. Running, sometimes, because she was convinced moving at speeds most people would never be able to dream of would never get old, but katas were often boring. Genjutsu, though, she was glad that the fourth had instituted genjutsu training in her second to last year. She and Ino had always been neck and neck in academics, but Ino had always gotten the better of her in physical stuff, though Hinata had consistently beaten the both of them there. But with genjutsu training, both the most basic of basics, and dispelling, Sakura finally found something that had proved to her she was good at something besides theory. It had made her decide to push herself harder. That maybe she could be something more than average. Her parents had supported her, and she'd graduated with the highest academic scores of any of the kunoichi, barely beating out Ino. But even that didn't give her nearly enough confidence to be on a team like this. She had been so caught up in her thoughts, she'd barely noticed Obito's question. "What?" she'd blurted, before blushing. Naruto had laughed. Not mean-spiritedly, but it had still made Sakura's blush only grow. Obito had merely smiled. "I said," he said gently, "why do you want to be a ninja?" That had brought Sakura up cold. Why did she want to be a ninja? She'd started out because she'd wanted to be closer to Sasuke. When she had been younger, he'd been fascinating. And handsome. The fact that both her parents were Chunin had only contributed. She didn't know what she wouldn't have done, being a ninja was what her family was. Not defending the leaf just didn't enter into her thoughts. But she'd thought that she would end up like them. A career shinobi. A Chunin by her late teens or early 20s, and then doing whatever she could to help the village till she either retired or until she died. But Sakura had never really considered the idea of dying in service to Konoha. She'd been too young. She still was, honestly. But the concept was no longer so completely alien, unable to be understood. So, did she want to be a ninja because she wanted to serve the village? To die for it? Or because she wanted to be close to Sasuke? Sakura didn't know. The astonishment and shame she'd felt at that discovery must have shown on her face, because Obito had looked at her askance and leaned back onto the railing on the edge of the roof, waiting for her answer. Naruto had cocked his head, his bright blue eyes curious. Sasuke had just remained fixed, staring up at the sky. "I don't know," Sakura had finally whispered. Naruto had asked articulately. Sakura had just shaken her head. "I don't know." Obito had blinked. Sakura had almost flinched at the tiny motion. She'd practically been able to hear him say what she had been thinking. "So why are you here?" There had been a moment of silence. Silence that Obito had mercifully broken. "You guys aren't out of the woods yet, you know," he'd said. "There's one test left." Naruto had rolled his eyes grandiosely. Yeah. What time?" Obito had looked distinctly unimpressed. Tomorrow. 7 in the morning. Training Field 7. Sakura had wondered if they'd been assigned that field based on their team number, or if it was just a coincidence. The same could go for their meeting time. Also, 7 in the morning? She hadn't been the only one to blanch. Sasuke, as usual, had kept his cool, but Naruto had protested loudly. Obito hadn't cared. And so now, she was here. It was too early in the morning, it was rather chilly despite the sun having risen about 30 minutes earlier. The forest surrounding the small clearing was buzzing with life, and her teacher had just handed her a small silver bell. She stared down at it. Obito made his way over to Naruto, and dropped a bell in his hand as well. "Well, you see Naruto," he was saying, sounding perfectly cheerful. "This is a bit different from the bell test your dad's told you about. I decided to switch it up a little." Naruto asked wordlessly. Obito's voice became drier than the average desert, moving somewhere into the realm of a sandstorm. "Well, first off, I'm handing the bells to you," he said, plopping another one of the things in Sasuke's outstretched hand. "Oh yeah." Naruto rubbed the back of his head. "I just figured you were giving up, you know. Since we'd snatch them from you so quick and all." Obito loudly snorted. Naruto grinned. Sakura just shrunk in on herself. Apparently, she would have had to steal something from her teacher if he'd gone with the normal bell test. And unlike Naruto, she wasn't confident she could have managed that. "Yes, well, your imminent victory aside, I've decided to take a different tack with this one," Obito said, stepping back. "Which is?" Sasuke finally spoke up. He focused on his older relative, his eyes intense. Obito spoke up, making sure that all of his students could hear him. Sakura especially. "Listen, each of you has a bell," he said. Naruto made to interrupt, and Obito glared at him. Naruto didn't interrupt. "That bell is your ticket to being a shinobi." "What do you mean?" Sasuke asked quietly. What did he mean? Did they have to turn the bells in somewhere? No, this was a test. It wouldn't be that simple. Obito smiled. Unlike the last one, this one was rather grim. You have to hold on to that bell for the next 20 minutes. If you lose it, you'll be going right back to the academy, he said. A jolt of ice shot down Sakura's spine. Her fist tightened around her bell. It was suddenly much more important that she not accidentally drop it. Pfft. That's it. Naruto gloated. That's simple. Where's the dash? I'll be trying to take them, of course, Obito said, and Naruto shut up, a stricken look on his face. I think I'll give you guys a head start. How about a minute? Obito continued. Team 7 stared. Obito cocked an eyebrow. Get going, he said, and then he vanished. Sasuke made an indistinct noise to her left, and Sakura turned to him. He was smiling. This should be interesting, he said. I'll say. Naruto piped in cheerfully. We've got a minute, plenty of time for a couple traps. We gotta get ready. He turned to Sakura. Come on. He grinned. And then he took off towards the edge of the clearing, Sasuke following him. They were headed for the forest. Sakura blinked, and threw herself after them. She drew up next to Sasuke, her mind whirling. What are we doing? She asked quietly. Do we have a plan? Sasuke snorted. Just stay on your toes. I doubt Obito will be going all out, but we still should be dash. At that moment a dark blue blur shot from the canopy and hit Sasuke so hard that he just vanished. One moment he was next to her, the next, he wasn't. The young Uchiha rocketed backwards, bouncing off the ground with an audible thump and rolling several painful meters. Sakura slowly turned towards him and stared, nearly tripping over her own feet. Sasuke stumbled to his feet mid-roll, his expression somewhere between enraged and agonized. Sakura stood and watched him, before turning towards where he'd been a moment before. Obito was standing there, a neutral expression on his face. Sakura yelped and jumped backwards, tightening her hand around her bell. She could hear Naruto yelling as he ran back towards them. What the hell? he demanded, skidding to a stop next to Sakura and glaring at his teacher. That wasn't a minute. He yelled. That was barely 20 seconds. What do you think you're dash? Obito slowly turned his head towards Naruto. The blonde boy froze. No, the older Uchiha said calmly. That wasn't a minute. And then he vanished again, and Naruto was left gaping. Sakura was too, but she recovered slightly sooner. She took off towards Sasuke, who stood stock still, shaking. Sasuke. Are you dash? We're in trouble, he interrupted her. He looked, almost scared. More annoyed than anything else, but Sakura could still see something in his eyes that she never had before. Huh. Naruto jogged over, casting wary glances all around. He's not holding back. Sasuke grimaced, rubbing his chest. That almost broke my ribs. What? No way. No way Obito would do that. Naruto shook his head. It must have been an accident, right? I mean dash. No. No way that their sensei would try to break their ribs. Right? Uchiha don't make mistakes, Sasuke said, and Naruto stopped. Sakura stiffened. We have to get out of here. Stick together, too, if we're not careful, he'll pick us off. Naruto stared. Then, he turned to Sakura. So, you wouldn't happen to have some sort of awesome sensing jutsu, would you? He asked casually, almost betrayed by the slight tremor in his voice. She shook her head wordlessly. Naruto sighed shakily, but he kept grinning. Damn. Oh no. She was completely useless here. How long did they have to hold on to the bells? 20 minutes. That was too long. An eternity. Obito had almost taken Sasuke out in less than a second. What chance did they have against that? Naruto must have noticed that she was trembling, because his smile just stretched wider. It looked all the more fake for it. Hey, don't worry, he said. We got this. He turned back to Sasuke, leaving Sakura exactly as reassured as she'd been at the start of the conversation. Which wasn't very. Sasuke? You good? The Uchiha responded by pulling himself to his feet. His onyx eyes narrowed slightly, and red bled into them. His Sharingan swirled into existence, the two tomo rotating lazily. Next time, he said steadily, I'll see him coming. Naruto's smile turned real, and Sakura calmed down slightly. Of course. Sasuke had a Sharingan as well. That would even the odds a little. She ignored the niggling voice that pointed out that the difference between Sasuke and Obito was probably so great that his eyes wouldn't make much of a difference. All right then. Naruto pounded his hand into his fist, and turned around. Obito! He yelled. Sakura stared at him. What the hell was he doing? We're ready for you this time. That trick won't work twice. Naruto shouted. The forest didn't answer. Naruto's grin faded slightly. He looked back at Sakura. We gotta get going. He didn't sound as confident as he had a moment before. So long as we're moving, we got a better chance. They took off once again, staying as close together as possible. Sakura watched the forest carefully, her senses straining. There was nothing out there but the rustling of the wind and the screeches of the birds. Naruto, are you sure this will work? Sakura murmured, lying prone on the high branch next to the blonde. They were situated in a tree deeper in the forest, waiting patiently. Or at least, Naruto was waiting patiently, though he occasionally fidgeted. Sakura was almost jittering in anticipation. He grinned back, ignoring her subtle trembling. Course I'm sure. He whispered excitedly, before frowning. Unless he just teleports out of there. Sakura blinked. He can teleport. Oh, yeah. Naruto had definitely regained his confidence. It's his Sharingan, you know. Crazy, right? Eyes that let you teleport. He chuckled. I wonder what Sasuke will end up with, huh? Sakura shook her head, staring back out into the clearing. She couldn't see the trap Naruto had laid down, the ink had already vanished. She couldn't spot Sasuke either, the Uchiha had vanished into the undergrowth. She felt something brush her back, but when she looked back, there was nothing there. It must have just been the wind. Waiting for someone. The voice came from right above her, and she yelped, flipping over. Obito stood over her, staring down. His left eye was closed, but the right was open, the sheri non-active, and the sickle-sided triangle within the quadruple-blade circle spun so slowly it almost seemed like it wasn't moving at all. Sakura shrieked and kicked up with both feet, aiming for Obito's stomach. He didn't even flinch as his hand came up, effortlessly stopping both of Sakura's legs at the apex of their kick. She spun, trying to work her foot around his hand, and he pushed forward, forcing her to roll backwards or have her leg broken. She tumbled off the branch, flipping in the air. As she fell, she glimpsed Naruto tackling their teacher, carrying them both off of the tree. Sakura hit the ground, continuing her roll backwards and quickly coming to her feet. She stumbled, a little dizzy, but none the worse for her 20-foot fall. She stopped staggering just in time to watch Sasuke come out of nowhere and crash into Obito, knocking him right out from under Naruto. The man was on his feet before he even touched the ground, and then he and Sasuke were instantly caught up in a fierce taijutsu match. Sakura could barely follow it. Sasuke leapt into a handspring, kicking for Obito's face, but the older man deflected the blow and spun around, kicking low at Sasuke's hand. The younger Uchiha popped into the air, clearing the kick easily, and attempted to grab Obito's leg. Which was when Sakura's new sensei flipped into a brutal axe kick with barely a hint of motion, catching Sasuke in the legs and spiking him into the ground. The Uchiha bounced, and Obito kicked out again as he landed, knocking Sasuke away. He tumbled out of the clearing, almost knocking over Sakura, who barely managed to catch him. Naruto scrambled to his feet, his hands coming together in a simple sign. "Gotcha!" he shouted. And then the clearing exploded. The blast was overwhelming, blowing leaves off of trees for dozens of feet around. Sakura's hair flew back, and her face grew hot. The sound was almost a physical thing, followed by the pressure wave, which knocked her flat on her butt. Sasuke came with her, and they both ended up prone, staring at the devastated clearing as Naruto made a noise that could only be described as cackling as burning leaves rained down around him. "Ha! Ha ha! Didn't see that coming, did ya?" He laughed, shaking with adrenaline. "You just gonna walk that one off, Obito?" "No need." Sakura's eyes went wide as the Uchiha swirled into existence behind Naruto, who froze, slowly turning his head back. He managed to say, before the dark blue man punched him so hard that Sakura didn't even see him hit the ground. 1 second Naruto was standing, the next he was flat on his face, completely still. Obito casually turned around, staring at her and Sasuke. He shook his head, and muttered quietly. "Language. I'll have to talk to Kushina about that." Then, he spoke up, raising his voice. "That was a decent attempt. But your teamwork needs work." He crossed his arms. "Try again." He stepped down, reaching down, and grabbing Naruto's ankle. The blonde was completely insensible. He didn't even groan. The boy twisted out of existence, vanishing without a sound, and Obito stood back up. Sakura stared. Sasuke pulled himself to his feet, away from her. "You say our teamwork needs work, and then you take him away," he yelled, coughing, and favoring his left leg. "How are we supposed to work together if he's stuck in Kamui? There's no way I can get in there dash." "Indeed." Obito sounded distinctly unimpressed, his left eye was still closed. "What a shame." And then he twisted out of existence just as Naruto had, and Sakura was left alone with Sasuke, who stared at the spot where their teacher had been a moment before, growling. The both of them sat in silence for a moment. Sasuke's hands clenched and unclenched, and he ground his teeth. Sakura was lost inside her own head, and barely noticed. Naruto was just gone. Could Obito do that? And if he could, why hadn't he before? When he'd been standing right over her. Why hadn't he taken her? Sasuke? She finally asked, edging closer to him. He twisted his head towards her, frowning intensely. "He's messing with us," he said, as if such a thing was the most personal insult he'd ever heard. "He's messing with me?" Sakura blinked. Sasuke, what should we do? Naruto's gone, it's just the two of us. How are we supposed to dash? He held his hand up. He doesn't want us to beat him. And... He paused, and snapped his head back towards where Naruto had been, before breaking into a run, scrambling through the grass. Sakura blinked, and jogged after him. He dropped to one knee when he reached the patch of matted grass where his friend had been a moment before. Something silver glinted in the dim light of the forest as Sasuke picked it up. He left it, he said quietly. What? Sakura asked, barely able to hear him. She bent over his shoulder, looking at what he held in his hand. Sasuke opened it, showing her what he held. Obito left Naruto's bell, he said clearly, before standing up, Sakura backing away to give him room. That means he's not disqualified yet, so long as we hold on to it, he can make it through. He reached out his hand. You take it. Sakura looked down at the bell in confusion, then back at Sasuke. She blushed, very slightly. Me? She asked carefully. Why dash? I've got the best nin and taijutsu, Sasuke said matter-of-factly. When Obito comes back again, I'll be the one fighting him. It's better for you to hang on to the bell, in that case, we can't afford to lose it. Sakura gulped, and took the bell into her hand, staring at it. Funny to think that something so small could be so important. She literally held Naruto's future in her hands. Do you have a plan? She asked, cradling the bell. Sasuke looked away from her, out into the forest. I don't have any fuinjutsu like Naruto does, he mused, talking to himself just as much as he was to her. I have some wire, but there's no way he wouldn't see it coming. He looked back at her. They'll be better than nothing, though. Maybe we can distract him, and then I can take him down. Sasuke. Sakura said quietly. The young Uchiha stared at her, cocking an eyebrow. We don't have to fight him, you know. We just have to hold on to our bells until the time limit is up. Wouldn't it be easier to dash? Maybe, he cut her off casually, and Sakura stopped talking immediately. But we can't just wait around for him. If we do nothing, we've good as lost. Sakura paused, then sighed, and dropped her head slightly. He was right, of course. Just waiting for Obito to show up wouldn't do them any good. Okay, she said, trying to sound calm. So, where should we go from dash? I feel like you aren't taking this seriously enough. Sakura spun, looking around for the source of the baritone. Sasuke merely stiffened, and then looked straight up. Sakura stopped, looked at him, and then followed his gaze. Obito was hanging upside high above them, his feet stuck to a particularly large branch. He stared down at them, his arms crossed, frowning softly. Sasuke hissed and backed up. Sakura dropped back as well, bringing herself closer to her teammate. She couldn't hope to fight Obito by herself. This isn't a game, you know, the older Uchiha said softly, his voice like water running over steel. Do you think you can afford to just sit around in the forest, making plans? He shook his head. Your teammate is gone. Don't you think you should be figuring out how to deal with his absence? Or save him? Sasuke shot back. Sakura glanced at him. Hadn't he said earlier that saving Naruto would be impossible? Apparently, that didn't matter to him anymore. Obito chuckled. You saying things like that make me think that maybe this exercise isn't so pointless. He uncrossed his arms, bringing one to his sides, and the other just below his mouth. Why don't you prove me right? His right hand, the one near his face, began running through signs. Sakura stared. There was no way. Was their sensei really going to dash? Katon, he said, sounding supremely bored. Beside her, Sasuke tensed, bending his knees. Sakura glanced at him in a panic, and then back at Obito. She felt cold. Hozenka no Jutsu, Obito finished, bringing his hand to his mouth. And then he spat dozens of tiny fireballs, turning the air above Sakura into a descending inferno. The Harano yelped and jumped back, barely avoiding one of the flames as it crashed into the ground where she had been standing, reducing the grass to so much blackened mulch. She looked back up, and could see nothing but fire. There was a whisper of movement, and she jerked her head to the left. Sasuke was there, glaring at her, his two-tomo Sharingan spinning rapidly. He was so fast. How could he be that fast? "Sakura, move," he whispered, seemingly louder than any shout Sakura had ever heard, and then he shoved her as hard as he could, sending her flying backwards. There was a great boom as the fireballs struck a moment later, frying everything below Obito. She hit the ground and tumbled, skidding across the grass and eventually coming to a stop flat on her back, covered in tiny scrapes. She looked back at where she'd come from, but Sasuke was nowhere to be seen. The forest was completely engulfed in flames over there, filling the air with smoke and heat and making it impossible to see anything. "Sasuke!" she shouted, scrambling to her feet. There was no way he'd been taken out by something like that. There was no way their sensei would have done something so. "He's not the one you should worry about." The face came from directly to her right, and Sakura jumped away from it instinctively, falling into an Academy Taijutsu stance, her foot sliding out in front of her and her arms loosening themselves in anticipation of a punch. She panted, adrenaline coursing through her system and jittering her clenched fists, and glared at her sensei, one of her lips pulling back slightly. Obito stopped, cocking his head. "Oh," he said curiously. "You want to test your taijutsu, do you?" His right eye, its strange Sharingan whirling unbelievably slowly, watched her intently. His left was still closed. She paused, staring back. Slowly, Sakura began to realize exactly what she was doing. Before she could act on that realization and take back one of the stupidest decisions of her life, Obito shrugged, casually dropping into a relaxed pose. His Sharingan melted away, his eyes returning to the recognizable Uchiha onyx, and he opened his left one, revealing a perfectly ordinary eye there as well. Sakura wondered, under the constant mental chant of, "Idiot, idiot, idiot," why he had closed that eye. Had it been a handicap for them? "I'll make it a bit fairer for you, then," he said, grinning slightly, gesturing offhandedly at his face, and the sudden lack of pinwheel eyes to be found there. "Show me what you got." Sakura gulped audibly, a drop of sweat running down her neck. She glanced around, but Sasuke was still nowhere to be seen. Obito seemed to be the only thing left in the whole forest. She didn't want to look at him, so she looked down instead. Her breathing was unusually loud in her head. She could run. She wouldn't make it very far, but she could run. But that would just lose her bell, and Naruto's, which she had slipped into one of her many, many pockets, along with her own. So what else could she do? "You fight, of course." Ah. It was that voice again. The voice that always came to her whenever Ino showed her up, or Naruto did something stupid, and even though Ino was her friend and Naruto was the Hokage's son, something in Sakura just begged her, demanded of her, that she pound them into the dirt. The voice that scared Sakura like nothing else, because other people didn't have voices in their head, did they? Didn't have voices that told them to hurt people, at least. But now. Maybe the voice was right. The only thing she could do now was fight. Anything else would get her disqualified. "Why do you want to be a shinobi?" Sakura's hands stopped trembling, and her eyes hardened. She stared back at Obito, who was watching her patiently. That didn't matter right now. She could figure out why she was a ninja after she became one. There was a gust of wind, rustling the grass around Sakura's sandals, and she took it as her cue to move. She charged straight ahead, her hand flashing through hand signs. Obito just watched her, not shifting from his stance. It was a simple set. She wouldn't have left the academy without it. For Sakura, it was effortless. Tiger, boar, ox, dog. The most basic Bunshin technique, intangible clones, good for nothing but distractions. But maybe distractions would be all she'd need. She jumped, high as she could, pumping chakra into her legs and soaring well over Obito's reach. There was a moment, just a second of surprise clear on his face, where his eyes didn't track her. She brought her hands together, and silently finished the technique. 3 Sakuras shifted into existence besides her in midair, 2 to her left, and 1 to her right. They all landed besides Obito, though there was only the sound of a single person hitting the grass. The clones weren't physical, after all. As Obito turned to look at them, they all reached into a hip pouch and drew gleaming kunai. Sakura felt her hand brush the bells she carried. They were much warmer than the metal around them. Then, Sakura and her duplicates rushed forward as one. The one on her right went low, diving for Obito's gut. The clone directly to her left went high, leaping into the air and kicking for her sensei's face. The one next to it darted farther to the left, circling the man and sending its illusionary kunai flying right at his kidneys. Sakura herself ran straight ahead, her kunai held in front of her, aiming for her sensei's chest. She didn't want to kill him, she really didn't think she could, anyway. Obito barely moved. He twitched his head slightly back, and the clone that had jumped missed completely, its foot striking nothing but air. Obito's hair wasn't even ruffled, and his eyes narrowed. That one was a fake, its kick hadn't pushed the air aside. He slid forward, allowing the thrown kunai coming from his left to barely scrape him, brushing along his jacket. The material wasn't ripped, the one on his left was an illusion as well. 2 Sakuras remained, one was a clone. One was diving forward, ready to gut him, and the other was sprinting, a kunai held in front of her. The Uchiha watched them for half a second, and both Sakuras stared back, glaring at him with scared green eyes. Sakura knew, then and there, that Obito knew which one was her. He proved her right a moment later by flipping sideways into the air, neatly clearing the diving clone, and coming right for her, his foot extended for a very painful kick. Sakura came to a very sudden stop and raised her kunai, presenting the flat side to Obito and bracing her arm behind it. He hit like a falling tree, and she skidded backwards, her sandals digging a groove in the grass. Her hand felt broken. But it was still moving, and there hadn't been a horrific snapping noise, so she'd gotten lucky, and it was only sprained. Obito didn't stop when he silently touched back down. He didn't wait for Sakura to shake out her hand. He just came for her again, fast, so fast it made Sasuke's speed look like hers, and Sakura brought her knife back up. She took a deep breath. Obito spun, sweeping his foot low. Sakura jumped over it, and he halted the motion in an instant, sending out a brutal straight arm and hitting her dead in the chest. She was blown back, her entire body aching, and hit the ground once more, rolling to her feet in less than a second. And then Obito charged again, his face expressionless. Sakura brought her left hand up, the other maintaining an iron grip on the kunai, and focused her chakra, feeling it rush through her arms and eyes. Kai! She murmured, and then rushed at her sensei, crouching low. If the genjutsu worked, then Obito would see her charging at her full height, the kunai pulled back for an unprofessional downward sweep. It was a good thing he'd deactivated his Sharingan. If he hadn't, she would have already lost, without a doubt. Obito's elbow darted out over her head, knocking an imaginary Sakura into next week. Sakura saw the opening and took it, stabbing up at the joint. Her sensei shook his head at the same moment, snapping his onyx gaze down at her. His eyes went wide. Sakura grinned. Gotcha. She was completely unprepared for him to leap, bringing his knee up and knocking the knife clean out of her hands, sending it twirling into the forest. There was a moment of silence as Sakura rocked back, shocked by the sheer speed of her sensei, thrown off her guard by the force of his knee. Obito landed, coming to a stop a foot in front of her and standing up straight, staring down at her with narrowed eyes. Nice one, he said after a pause, grinning slightly. Sakura stared in disbelief. Her teacher frowned. Though it would have worked much better if Sasuke, as usual, came out of nowhere at that exact moment, trailing steel wire, his Sharingan whirling, and his face set in an anticipatory grimace. Sakura barely saw any of that. To her, it just seemed like a black blur with 2 glinting red highlights smashed into her sensei's side, carrying him away from her. Obito rolled to his feet, kicking Sasuke off of him as he did so. The younger Uchiha barely minded, falling into a ready position, his arms stretched at his sides, wires wrapped around his fingers shining in the dim light of the forest. Sasuke, Obito said quietly. You wouldn't have happened to have used Sakura as bait, would you? What? There was no way. Sasuke wouldn't have done something like that. Sasuke just snorted, turning his head very slightly to look at his teammate. Sakura, he said curtly. Back up. I don't want you getting caught in this. Sakura obliged without thinking, leaping backwards and gaining distance from both her teammate and her teacher. What exactly have you cooked up, Sasuke? Obito crossed his arms, closing his eyes. What did you use the time your teammate bought you for, huh? The thing that'll win us this test. Sasuke smirked. That's all. Obito said quietly. He shook his head. Then you should have done it, Sasuke, instead of telling me about it. The younger Uchiha's eyes went wide as the older one rushed him with unbelievable speed. Sakura only caught a glimpse of movement before her new teammate was lifted into the air by his throat, his legs kicking futilely. Guess you'll be joining Naruto, then, the man holding him sighed. Sakura watched incredulously as her teammate began to swirl out of existence, just as Naruto had. He hadn't even had a chance to try whatever he had planned. She pulled another kunai from one of her pouches, pulling back for a toss. Maybe it would distract Obito enough for Sasuke to break free and... But then, she paused. Beneath Obito's hand, Sasuke was grinning, baring his teeth in a vicious smile. What did he have to be smiling about? And then, just before Sasuke disappeared entirely, he popped in a puff of smoke. Sakura caught a flash of something small and colorful attached to a log in his place, before it disappeared. Obito snapped his head towards the forest. Substitution is useless against the Sharingan, Sasuke. You know this. Sasuke stepped out from behind a tree just to Sakura's right, his arm held up, his hand holding something barely visible in the shadow of the canopy. A piece of ninja wire. It extended back into the forest, lost among the trees. Sakura blinked. That had been unbelievably quick. There was no way she would have been able to pull off a substitution on such short notice, and with such precision. And with Obito sucking Sasuke into whatever his eye created, fighting the draw on his chakra. Sasuke was even more skilled than she'd thought. Pretty useless, yeah, Sasuke admitted. Unless, I want you to use Kamui. Obito stiffened, before relaxing, his arms falling to his sides. He shifted his gaze back and forth between Sakura and Sasuke. What was in the scroll, Sasuke? Sasuke chuckled. Wouldn't you like to know? Sakura shuffled sideways, keeping an eye on Obito. Sasuke, she murmured. What was in that scroll? He glanced sideways at her. Just give me a sec, he said with a small smile. Sakura felt something flutter at the look. You'll see. Obito stepped forward. Don't move, Sakura, Sasuke muttered, and then he pulled hard on the wire he held in his hand. There was a hissing noise, and suddenly the forest was full of steel. Kunai and Senbon, each trailing their own shining steel string, flew from seemingly every direction, piercing Obito hundreds of times. None of it touched him, of course, but it was impressive nonetheless. Obito didn't even flinch. He just cocked his head, uncaring of all the wires passing through him, acting as if he hadn't just effortlessly survived a hail of metal that had left the surrounding trees speckled with metal. The whole stretch of grass he stood in was utterly filled with the wires slicing the air and making movement impossible. Obito stood in the center of it, his arms crossed once more. That was your plan? He asked calmly. Sasuke, did you really think dash? He stiffened, and looked down, dropping his hands to his side. Sakura narrowed her eyes, trying to catch sight of whatever had gotten his attention. Wires were wrapping themselves around Obito's abdomen, appearing from absolutely nowhere. A tag or two joined them, adorned with simple kanji. Sakura stared in confusion, and Obito in annoyance. He grunted. Clever. Then, he was yanked back by an invisible force, falling to the ground. Sasuke rushed forward, dancing his way through the wires effortlessly, and seized the one wrapped around Obito's stomach, while Sakura watched, apprehensive and confused. Obito, watching her carefully, just sighed. The tags on his stomach began to hiss. Enough. And then he swirled out of existence, disappearing entirely, and Sasuke was left clutching at air. The Uchiha made an annoyed noise and straightened up, careful not to cut himself on any of the wires around him. Damn, he grunted, sounding eerily like Obito himself, before turning back to Sakura. Thanks for distracting him, Sakura. I almost had him. He began to gingerly remove himself from the field of wires. Sakura spoke up, trying not to sound too confused. What did you do? Where did those wires come from? Sasuke didn't look at her while he answered, focused on clearing his own wire trap. Obito's intangibility technique places him in another place, somewhere only he can access. When he took Naruto, he put him there as well. With one last leap, he alighted in front of Sakura, clear of the wires. Basically, I sent Naruto a scroll full of wires and explosive tags when I substituted away from Obito. I was hoping that idiot would be able to keep him busy while I forced a surrender. He shrugged. Didn't work, I guess. Sakura twisted her hands. So, what do we do now? Sakura looked past her, his Sharingan still spinning idly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his bell. Now? I guess we just dash. The Uchiha vanished. Sakura stumbled backwards, startled, and fell on her butt. Sasuke's bell hit the grass without a sound. Sakura whipped her head around, searching desperately. It was no use. Sasuke was just gone. Slowly she pulled herself to her feet, inching forwards and bending down to pick up Sasuke's bell. It gleamed in her hand, warm against her palm. She stared at it for a moment, entranced, before jerking her head up. Sasuke! She yelled, looking around once more, hoping that for some reason, maybe this time he would appear. He didn't. She paused. Naruto. Sakura's voice was quieter, as the reality of her situation sunk in. She was alone, holding both of her teammates' bells. Her hand tightened around Sasuke's. Sakura. She spun, scanning the trees, her eyes wide. It was Obito. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. I would suggest you run. And then, the forest was silent once more. Sakura looked around one last time, and then tucked Sasuke's bell into her pouch. She took off into the forest, sprinting as fast as she could. She'd pass this test. She had to, now. Sasuke and Naruto were counting on her. Do you know what you did wrong? Obito asked them, as they lay in the grass, nursing their injuries. Sasuke didn't say anything, rubbing the bruise on his face instead. He appeared to be sulking, though Sakura didn't think she'd ever seen him do anything quite like that before. Naruto spoke up. We went up against you. He grinned, rubbing the back of his head. Obito chuckled. Nice try. He shook his head, turning to Sakura, who was twisting her ankle, testing its range of motion. Sakura. He said calmly. She jerked her head up towards him. What do you think? Sakura stared at her teacher. She said, racking her brain. What had they done wrong? They'd done the best they could, Obito was just too fast and too strong for them. We didn't. She said slowly. Obito watched her carefully. Sakura gave up under the piercing onyx gaze. I don't know. She lowered her head into her legs. I never know. Obito intoned. Well. He sat down on the grass, crossing his legs under him. You didn't watch out for each other. What? Naruto shot to his feet, pointing an accusing finger at his teacher. That's a load of crap and you know it. Sasuke and I dash. Yes. Obito cut him off effortlessly. Sasuke and you. He glanced meaningfully at the other Uchiha. And what did Sakura do? Sakura frowned, leaning forward. I fought you, she said somewhat indignantly. I gave Sasuke time to set up his trap. And they wouldn't have passed unless I'd. Sakura gulped unconsciously, touching a hand to her stomach. Her throat still felt raw. Obito nodded. And that was very brave of you. Sakura blushed, falling back and losing her voice, while he continued. But you two didn't plan that. Sasuke just took advantage of your courage. An admirable trait in a shinobi. Obito pulled himself to his feet. But not in a teammate, he declared, his voice heavy. He looked down at all of them. Sasuke just stared up, his expression unreadable. Naruto's eyes were narrowed, his lips pursed. It was the kind of face he made when he knew he was wrong, but didn't want to admit it. Sakura was still looking at the grass, her head locked between her legs. Obito sighed. If it weren't for Sakura, neither of you would have passed, even if her method was unorthodox, he said, vaguely gesturing at Sasuke and Naruto. The blonde glanced at Sakura, a questioning look on his face. Obito continued. As it is, I'm hesitant to do it in the first place. However, he held up a hand, cutting off Naruto's inevitable cry of indignation before it could be born. I know there's a lot of potential with you guys. And I hope that you'll grow into that. The Uchiha smiled. So, congratulations. Today, you are all officially shinobi of the leaf. Naruto cheered, Sasuke grinned, and Sakura looked up at her teacher with thankful, but uncertain eyes. Obito grinned at her and tapped 2 fingers to his forehead. So, for now, Team 7, dismissed. Then, he flickered out of existence, and Sakura was left alone with her new team. Naruto turned to her, his teeth shining. Sakura, he said. How did you keep the bells away from Obito, huh? He pounded his fists together enthusiastically. He kicked the crap out of the both of us, how'd you stop him? Sakura blushed, and told him. And Naruto laughed. Obito Sensei Chapter 3.5 Family. I'm home. Naruto, as he did with every entrance, burst through the door, stomping wet grass into the entryway carpet. Already. A woman called from deeper within the house. Naruto strode forward, rubbing a stray bit of soot off his shoulder. All the waste he deposited on the ground vanished an instant after it hit the carpet, along with whatever associated stains it left behind. His mother had gotten tired of cleaning up after him when he'd been younger, and shanghaied his father into helping her with what he had called, Project Keep the Floor Clean with Space and / Time. Naruto had thought the name was dumb when he was younger, and that hadn't changed. But he would always admit with a smile on his face that not having to worry about leaving a mess was probably the best thing his parents had done for him. He didn't have much of a perspective about it, but that was unavoidable. The blonde strode into the main living room, almost tripping over the low table that just barely jutted out from behind the doorframe for what must have been the 1000th time. His mom had never been able to convince his dad to move it. Everything in the room, he insisted, was right where it should be, and moving that table would mess it all up. His mother was sitting on a short couch in the middle of the room, a huge scroll stretched out on a table in front of her, covered in esoteric swirls and unrecognizable kanji. She was glaring at the thing, her light gray eyes furrowed and her lower lip pouting, but as soon as he half-hopped over the stupid foot-high table, she shot her gaze up to him, a wide smile spreading on her face. There was an ink brush in her hair, still wet, streaking parts of the vibrant red with a dull black, but she didn't seem to notice. That was quick. Kushina Uzumaki said, beaming at her son, who beamed back with an identical grin, uncaring of the multitude of scuffs, small burns, and bruises covering his body. She narrowed her eyes. Obito didn't go easy on you, did he? She accused, trying to sound serious and failing. Somehow, Naruto's grin intensified. Nope. He chirped. He kicked the shit out of me. His mother rolled her eyes. Language. Hey. That's what happened, though. Naruto protested, plopping down on the couch next to her. What am I supposed to call it? He beat you to a pulp. Kushina suggested cheerfully. Curb stomped you? Gave you a panda makeover? Made you squeal like a dash. She paused. Wait. Scratch that last one. She shrugged, her hair bouncing with the motion, the brush streaking more of it. Doesn't matter. Did you pass? Course I passed. Naruto said indignantly. Who do you think I am? He didn't wait for an answer. I'm Naruto Namikaze. Kushina reached out and flicked him in the forehead. Naruto leaned back, but he was never fast enough. Course you are, she said. How'd you do it? Naruto explained, with several grand hand motions, some shouting, and the occasional pantomime, how the battle against Obito had gone. Kushina watched the whole thing with a smile that had shifted from sunny to gentle. And then he dumped me on the ground, and told us that we'd passed, he concluded. Kushina looked unimpressed. You tried to blow him up? She asked archly. I knew he'd dodge it, Naruto said indignantly. He's Obito. His mom just sighed. Fair enough, I guess. She perked up. So, that new seal worked. Perfectly. Naruto said. You got anything you don't need? Wait, it's fine. I think. He rummaged around in one of his many pockets, while Kushina leaned over curiously. Aha! He triumphantly withdrew an empty cup of ramen. You were keeping that in your jacket? Kushina asked, grinning, and exposing some of her elongated canines. Naruto just grinned back, his more ordinary-looking teeth shining. It's coming in handy now, right? He said, before jumping up off the couch. I'm gonna do it in here, "K?" Kushina just nodded, looking eager. Awesome. Naruto looked away from her, refocusing on the empty cup. He stared at it, took a deep breath, and then squeezed. Ink spiraled out over the cup, forming over the paper and plastic, and Naruto tossed it straight up. It exploded before it got 3 feet, blowing Naruto's hair back and depositing more soot on his shoulders. The sound echoed throughout the room as Naruto sat back down, smiling at his mom. Her eyes were fairly sparkling. That is so cool, she murmured, and for a moment both Naruto and Kushina were united by something even deeper than the bond between mother and son, a love of things that went boom. So? Naruto said. What are you working on? Kushina shook her head. Oh, this. She said, gesturing to the scroll laying out in front of her. It's nothing. Just some work for the barrier squad. The weird hat guys? Naruto asked. Kushina suppressed a giggle and nodded. What do they want? Pfft. Kushina waved her hand. Just the impossible. Your dad wants to upgrade the barrier so that we'll know if people are coming into the village intending to hurt it. That's awesome. Naruto said. Before frowning. What's so tough about it, though? You could just dial it to killing intent, or dash. Yeah, but then anyone coming into the village in a bad mood would get swarmed by the Umbu, Kushina said patiently. Intent is too broad. And see this here. She pointed to a set of 3 swirling lines set in a box in the center of the scroll, and Naruto obligingly leaned in. That's the part that determines if they're wearing a headband, his mom explained. Unless I redo the whole thing from scratch, I gotta make sure that I don't mess that up, or we'll get nothing but false alarms. Naruto sat back. Huh, he said. How'd Dad get you to agree to this? That's crazy. Kushina rolled her eyes. Oh, you know. She smiled. He did that thing. You know, where he's like dash. Kushina, who else could do it, the 4th Hokage said, as his hands came down on his wife and son's shoulders. Naruto jumped, but Kushina just turned to her husband, smiling widely. Remind me why that worked for the millionth time. He just swooped down and kissed her appreciatively. Naruto stuck out his tongue, making a gagging sound, and both his parents rolled their eyes simultaneously. Minato pulled back, and Kushina made a soft sound. Right. That's why. Her husband just grinned, before turning to his son. You passed. He said. Course I did. Minato appraised him. Obito did a number on you, huh? Heh. Naruto rubbed the back of his head. Well, I did try to blow him up. Minato grinned his distinctive grin, the one that made his eyes shine but only moved his mouth a little, and nodded. Good. Gotta keep him on his toes, he said cheerfully. Then, his face tightened up slightly. Naruto barely noticed it. How was your team? He asked. Kushina unconsciously straightened up. Naruto waffled. Sasuke's on it. You know how that goes, he said, flashing his teeth. We basically just did what we always do. Mess around. Kushina suggested. Ruin village property. Minato said at the same time. Naruto just rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. We almost got Obito though. If he didn't have those cheap sherry non. How about your other teammate? Kushina asked. What, Sakura? Naruto said. His mom nodded. He grinned. She won us the test, he said proudly. Minato raised an eyebrow. Really? Yeah. Obito took me and Sasuke out, and left our bells to her. And then she kept him from getting them. For like, 5 minutes. Naruto nodded firmly. I didn't see it, but it must have been awesome. Wow, Kushina said. She sounds impressive. Not really, Naruto said. She doesn't have any jutsu or anything. I mean. His eyes lit up, and he turned to his dad. Hey. Didn't you say you were gonna show me something when I passed? Minato and Kushina traded glances, and a single sentence. We'll talk more about this later. Then Minato grinned and held up a finger. 1 sec, he said, and then he vanished. Kushina snorted. So lazy. She turned and looked behind the couch. It's only like a couple rooms away, you know. She shouted at the house. Ah. Minato shouted back, and then popped into existence beside Naruto again, on his other side. But getting there would take me at least a minute. Kushina just snorted again, at a loss for words. Naruto turned to his dad, just in time to almost fumble what he'd thrown at him. What? He looked down at what he'd caught. It was a water balloon. Hey. It's my job to throw these things. He looked up, pretending to be angry. Stop cutting in on my business. Minato just sighed. It's for you, he said exasperatedly. Huh. Naruto looked down at the balloon. What am I supposed to do with this? It's for the jutsu I'm going to teach you, Minato said. Naruto looked at his father suspiciously. It's not a water jutsu, right? 'Cause I suck at those. Minato just chuckled. Trust me, he said. This is no water jutsu. Then he reached out and grabbed Naruto's shoulder, looking at Kushina over it. We'll be back around 6, he said. Kushina waved, and then both her husband and her son vanished. Her smile not fading, she bent back over the table and began glaring at the seal again. ####. You did what? Mabuki Harano said, blinking. I swallowed the bells, Sakura said, staring down at her feet. Her mother burst out laughing, and she looked up, confused. Your father will love that, the woman said, grinning wildly. She looked over her daughter for a moment. Don't look so ashamed. You did great. Really? Sakura asked. Of course. Mabuki affirmed. You survived Mangekyo no Obito's challenge. And you did it almost by yourself. She clapped her hand down on Sakura's shoulder. How many others can say that? It doesn't matter if you did it with something weird, you must have impressed him, or he wouldn't have passed you in the first place. She took her hand back, her grin intensifying. And now, you're on a team with the Hokage's son, and an Uchiha prodigy. So keep your head up. Sakura felt herself blush. I barely did anything. They're the ones who kept him busy. There you go again. Her mother scolded. Downplaying yourself. They'd both be out of luck if it weren't for you. She brought her hand up to her chin, pondering for a moment. You should totally hold that over them. What? Sakura said, aghast. No. Why not? Her mother shot back. They totally owe you a debt now. Her eyes sparkled. Maybe you could worm a date out of that Uchiha. Sakura's eyes went wide, and she turned around without a word, stomping up the stairs and towards her room. Oakman. Her mom called after her. What's the holdup? I could use some Sherry non-grandkids. And that clan needs all the help it can get. You know I don't like when you say things like that. Sakura called back, embarrassment turning her words angry. She practically heard her mother's shrug. Yeah. Doesn't make it any less fun. Sakura just let out a frustrated moan, moderating her stomping and heading for her room. She passed the bathroom door on the way. Her mother's voice stopped her one last time. Hey. Make sure you get those bells out now. She laughed. I doubt that sensei of yours will want them back otherwise, and dinner is soon. Don't want you throwing that up too. Sakura froze, slowly turning her head towards the bathroom as her mother's cackles retreated. The sink gleamed at her, and she sighed, altering her stocking. The bathroom door swung closed behind her. ####. She sounds impressive. Sasuke's gaze didn't change much, though he did shift his legs under him. His eyes just sharpened a little. Really? Of course. She faced down Obito by herself. That alone says she's got something most of your classmates don't. Sasuke considered the notion. It was true that Sakura was definitely on a higher level than most of the other academy students. She'd been the top-scoring kunoichi, barely beating out the Yamanaka heir. But he'd never thought she'd been more than that. She had lacked something that he and Naruto didn't have. Pedigree, maybe? Both her parents were just ordinary Chunin. She had no bloodline. But it couldn't be that simple. The Yondaime hadn't had parents at all, shinobi or otherwise, and hadn't a bloodline to his name either. And he was the Yondaime. Sasuke resolved to figure it out later. He'd have to spend some more time with Sakura before he could be sure. Sasuke. He shook his head, glancing up from the table. Mikoto Uchiha watched him, a small smile on her face. It made the burn scars covering the left side of it crinkle. You drifted off for a second there, she said playfully. Thinking about her? Her smile didn't change. All right. If you want to be like that. She stood up from the mat, stretching her back out, and Sasuke followed her. Do you need anything? I know you already got dinner dash. He smiled at her, his lips barely twitching. I'm fine, he said. I'll get myself something if I get hungry. His mother pressed her lips together. All right. Just stay away from the tomatoes, all right? Kushina is coming over for those later. Sasuke blinked. What for? His mother grinned and made a shushing motion. Don't ask. That way, we can't be implicated. The younger Uchiha snorted, before nodding and wandering away, opening the sliding door leading out of the room and stepping into the compound proper. Mikoto watched him go. He wasn't wandering, of course, and both she and Sasuke knew it. But she wasn't going to stop him. If Sasuke wanted to talk to his father, that was up to him. Sasuke moved through the streets of the compound, his sandals scraping mutely on the concrete. The 1- and 2-story houses and walls around him, concrete and paper and wood, slid by, barely making an impression on him. Only the occasional Uchiha crest caught his attention, the splash of red and black springing an image of a pinwheel eye into his mind. He passed a couple clansmen as he wandered, most of them nodded to him, and Sasuke nodded back. 2 or 3 grinned and mentioned his new headband, still shiny and unscuffed, and Sasuke gave them vague agreements and thanks. Some of them realized that he wasn't entirely there with them, and allowed him to pass with little comment. Eventually, he reached his destination, a squat, windowless house with a single door of black lacquered wood. He pushed it open without ceremony, the greased hinges swinging open without a hint of protest. Silence greeted him, like it always did. He took a step forward. The floor was kept immaculately clean, but Sasuke nonetheless half expected his feet to kick up a cloud of choking dust. The silence was doing a fine enough job of choking him, anyway. It wouldn't have needed the help. So, Sasuke spoke. It was the only way to dispel the nothing that was strangling him. I passed, he said simply. The silence, momentarily taken aback, rushed back into the gap left after his sentence, and answered him in its own way. Sasuke's fist tightened. I'm a genin, now. He put a thumb to his Hitai, its shine had been dulled by the emptiness of the building. A shinobi of the leaf. Nothing happened. The proclamation didn't light up the room, or shift the stone floor. It just sunk into the silence, and became part of it. Sasuke took another step forward, and then another. I'm closer, he said. Closer to finding out why. His Sharingan spiraled out, and the dimness of the room slid away. Fugaku Uchiha's face was revealed, his customary frown unchanged from the last time Sasuke had seen it. Of course it was the same. Pictures didn't change. The mantle it sat on, the lone feature of the dim room, was also host to 20 and some other pictures, all the same size as Fugaku's, all with Uchiha immortally preserved on them. Some were frowning more severely than Fugaku, others were smiling, One was sticking his tongue out playfully. There was a candle set in the mantle before each of the pictures. Only a few were burning, Fugaku's wasn't one of them. Sasuke took another step forward, bringing one hand up slowly. "I'm not going to let him get away with it, father," he said. A flame sparked into existence in the palm of his hand, and he gently brought it to the unlit candle in front of his father's picture. The wick lit without a sound, and the dancing light of the flame in Sasuke's hand vanished, replaced by the gentle play of the candle's comparatively dull light. Sasuke's Sharingan, still active, gleamed in the candle's light. He stared intently at his father's picture, as if the man would come alive within it and give him some sort of affirmation of what he was saying. He didn't, of course. Fugaku Uchiha was dead, and dead men could do no such thing. Sasuke's eyes narrowed. "I swear it," he said, his voice trembling, his nails digging into his palm. "Itaka will pay." Chapter 4. The Mission. It was a gray day. The sky was a blank slate, overrun with pale clouds. The sun lay somewhere behind them, but its shape was completely hidden, light did not shine so much as leak into the world. Naruto looked down at the lake, the water was dim and gray, the same color as the sky, and it was almost impossible to see anything that was more than a couple feet down. The flash of pink he was hoping to see refused to appear. He suppressed a shiver. The water dripping off him wasn't cold, but the occasional gust of wind made it seem so. Sasuke?" he asked uncertainly. Sitting beside him, Naruto's friend glanced towards him. His dark hair had been made even darker by the water, and it damply hung down around his face, nearly obscuring it. "Is she still down there?" Sasuke shrugged, leaning forward and activating his Sharingan for a moment. He peered into the water, narrowing his eyes. "She is," he confirmed, leaning back. "It looks like she's sitting on the bottom." "What?" Naruto asked, starting to pace. "Should we go get her? She really needs to come up. It's been nearly dash." Sakura burst from the water with a great gasp, her hair wetly flapping about. She took another hasty breath, and then turned back towards the shore. "You guys are already out?" she asked, confusion flitting across her face. She started to swim back. Naruto gaped at her, and she frowned. "What?" The Namikaze refused to answer, so she turned to her other teammate. "Hey, Sasuke, how did I do?" A different voice interrupted. "Nearly 4 minutes." As he often did, Obito seemed to appear out of nowhere, wearing a large grin. Sakura stared at him in disbelief, and Team 7's sensei smiled back. "Very impressive, Sakura." He turned to Naruto and Sasuke. Naruto stopped pacing, shooting a grin back, while Sasuke remained lounging on the ground, acknowledging Obito with a nod. "That's an interesting exercise, you two," Obito said to the boys. "When did you come up with it?" "A while back," Naruto said cheerfully, shooting Sakura another impressed glance. "My mom told us that doing the oxygen thing." He waved his hands vaguely towards his chest, "with our lungs would help our chakra control." He turned to Sakura. "But we've never managed for more than 3 minutes." He practically shouted in enthusiasm. "That was awesome, Sakura." The girl blushed. "Thanks, Naruto." "Looks like Sakura really does have some impressive chakra control," Obito noted out loud. "Even better than yours, Sasuke." The younger Uchiha shrugged, his eyes wandering back to Sakura for a moment, and Naruto puffed up. "Hey, what about me?" Obito grinned. "Ah, you've got the worst control on the team, Naruto." The blonde squawked a protest, and his sensei laughed. "Maybe you should ask Sakura for some pointers, Little cooperation." Naruto turned to do just that, but Obito cut him off before he could. "You'll have to wait till later, though. We've got a mission." "A mission?" Sasuke asked, perking up. "What is it?" Sakura said. "Are we rescuing someone?" Naruto practically pleaded. Obito's grin widened. "Something like that." "A bridge." Naruto shouted indignantly for what had to be the 4th or 5th time. Sakura had lost count. Her teammate hammered another plank of wood into place, nearly crushing his own thumb. "We're never gonna get to do something interesting." Team 7 was working about 10 feet above one of the several canals running through Konoha. They'd been hired to help put together a connecting bridge. It wasn't much more than putting down a wooden foundation. The job was simple enough, but not the most exciting. Hence, Naruto's shouting. I did tell you it was something like rescuing someone. Think of all the time you'll be saving people. You're such a fatalist, Naruto, Obito said from the canal below. He was standing on the water, uncaring of the current rushing under his feet. Sakura stole a glance at her sensei every once in a while. Seeing someone so casually walk on water was still unusual for her to see. She supposed she'd get used to it eventually, but right now it just showed how far ahead their teacher was. I don't know what that means, but it's too long. Just like all these deranks. It's been a month. Naruto yelled back, finally finishing one stretch of walkway. The civilian overseeing the construction, a nice man with a balding head who'd introduced himself as Soma, gave the work a cursory inspection and then gifted Naruto with a sober thumbs up. Naruto returned the motion with a brilliant smile, and then turned to shout at his teacher some more. No, almost two. He huffed. Are you even gonna let us leave the village? Sakura kept her head down and worked as she listened to her loud teammate. Sasuke was being rather quiet. He went like a machine, laying planks and hammering them down with quick, efficient movements. To Sakura, it didn't seem like he cared about the monotonous work. His face was completely blank, though he did glance at their sensei occasionally. Of course I'll let you leave the village, Obito answered. He considered it, one hand cupping his chin. Eventually. Sakura suppressed a giggle at Naruto's frustrated groan. Suddenly, Obito stiffened, looking back over his shoulder. Sakura, still holding back her small laugh, followed his gaze. He was looking back at one of the other bridges, farther along the canal. There was a gaggle of Chunin crossing it, talking amongst themselves. One of them was noticeably limping, but didn't seem to care. They were followed by a frustrated-looking woman with long, straight brown hair and two purple markings on her cheeks. She looked like a Inuzuka or maybe an Akimichi, but was too clean-looking for the former and far too lean for the latter. Obito's eyes lit up at the sight of her, and without a word he bounded off over the water, leaving his team behind. He was nearly 100 meters away a moment later, leaping up onto the bridge and following the woman and Chunin out of sight. Sakura blinked and looked back to her team, confused by their sensei's sudden departure. Naruto sniggered, and Sasuke gave a faint smile. What was that? Sakura asked. It's Rin, Naruto said in a sing-song voice. Sasuke bounced a nail off the blonde's head, and Naruto flinched. Hey. You know what he'll do if he hears you saying it like that, Sasuke said with quiet amusement. We'll be lucky if we get stuck cleaning out the sewer system. He considered. With our bare hands. Sakura would probably be okay though. Well that's good. Sakura asked, and Sasuke nodded. She smiled. But who's Rin? One of Obito's old teammates, Sasuke answered. The only one who's left, Naruto said, unusually sober, and Sasuke bounced another nail off his head. Hey. She is. You can't mean. Sakura whispered, imagining. She felt like she was getting into something private, shared between the rest of the team, but not her. A transgression. But Naruto didn't seem to notice, or care. The other one died, back in the war, he explained, continuing his work. His name was Kakashi, he was one of my dad's students, actually. Everyone thought he was going to be this big prodigy, but apparently he got really unlucky. He shook his head, answering Sakura's unspoken question. I don't know what happened. They've never told me. Unlucky. Shinobi did get unlucky, they were just human, after all. Still, something about how casually Naruto said it sent a solitary chill racing down Sakura's spine. Prodigies sometimes got unlucky. What happened to people who didn't even have that? So Rin's sensei's old teammate, huh? Sakura asked, mostly talking to herself, trying to forget the cold. The sun was finally starting to come out, after all. He ran off so quickly, I guess if it was an old friend dash. Sasuke snorted. What? Naruto grinned mischievously. She's really nice, but they've got something going on. Oh. Sakura couldn't help herself. There was something undeniably romantic about two of the Hokage-sold students being involved. How long? Nah, it's not like that, Naruto said. But my mom says they've been dancing around each other since they got out of diapers. He sniffed. Kinda gross, but she always says stuff like that. Oh, Sakura said, turning that over in her head. So, an old teammate and a romantic interest that their sensei wouldn't pursue. Playing matchmaking between two jonin. Wait. Is she a jonin too? Sakura asked, before the silence could set in too much. Naruto nodded. Yeah, he said. She works at the hospital, but she goes out on missions every once in a while. He gave an envious grin. My dad says they're usually pretty high level. Sakura smiled back, the gears in her head turning. Playing matchmaker between two jonin was probably, no, definitely was an incredibly stupid idea, but there was a part of her that was giggling and rubbing its hands together at the thought of it anyway. If Ino were here she'd probably be doing the same thing. Still. Hey. Her sensei's voice broke Sakura's thought process, and she almost guiltily snapped her head back towards him. He'd appeared at the end of the bridge, where they'd started. His hair was ruffled, but he was smiling happily. Sorry about that, had to run. You guys look like you're having fun. They're nearly done for the day. Soma's gravelly voice cut in, drawing the shinobi's attention. The man was leaning against a half-complete railing, a half-grin twitching his lips up. You can all leave now, if you want, I really appreciate the help. Team 7 looked at each other, and then at their teacher. The decision was unspoken and unanimous. About 5 minutes later, after the tools were put away, the payments rendered, they said their goodbyes cheerfully and wandered into the streets of Konoha, their sensei in tow. The vibrant roads and colorful markets soon swallowed them. Sakura was enjoying the sound of coins in her pocket. She could buy something. A new outfit, maybe, or more now. The problem of her sensei and his teammate was pushed to the back of her mind. A month and a half of deranks, Sasuke finally spoke up, and Sakura instinctively looked at him, stopping in the middle of the road. Obito did too, and Naruto, who had been happily chattering to their teacher, hushed up. Naruto might be right, you know, Sasuke continued. We are ready, Obito. It's time to send us on a C-rank mission. That's Obito Sensei to you, little guy, Obito said lightheartedly, and Sasuke snorted. Though. Naruto rushed into the gap. That's two of us. What, you think we can't handle one? Obito paused again. I wonder. Sakura knew what she had to say. I think we're ready. It was quick, but sincere. Her sensei's eyes flickered over her in momentary surprise. I think I'm ready, is what she knew everyone else was hearing. That's why they'd been waiting, after all. Sakura had no illusions. Sasuke and Naruto were already far ahead of her, one of them had the Sharingan, and the other was the Hokage's son. She'd started behind, and was barely keeping up as it was. The 4 minutes at the bottom of the lake seemed years ago, instead of hardly an hour. See? Sakura says so too. Naruto said with a wide smile. Obito scratched the back of his head, regarding his team with warm eyes. But he was calculating something. Sakura could see it as clear as day, and she knew that if she could then her teammates certainly could as well. His other hand unconsciously brushed over the hilt of the short sword he always had strapped to his back. What the hell, he said. We had to turn in this mission anyway. Naruto hooped, Sasuke smiled, and Sakura tried to do the same, ignoring the prick cling in her gut. A C-rank, huh? The man at the desk today was their old teacher Iruka, as luck would have it. Sakura was very familiar with this room by now, it was where genin were assigned their peacetime missions. The room was spacious and open, with plentiful windows and hardwood floors. There wasn't much here besides desks and paperwork, and it was constantly bustling with shinobi doing their day's duties. Iruka leaned back in his uncomfortable-looking chair, crossing his arms. He gazed steadily at Sakura's sensei, his face set in a neutral expression. We actually just got one, less than an hour ago. By carrier bird, even. Oh. Obito asked. What was it? There's a town, out near the border of Suna, Iruka shrugged. Well, closer to the border than it is to Konoha, at least. It's called. He shuffled through one of the stacks of paper, extracting a particular ruffled one, and squinted at it. His scar crumpled slightly. Ah, Kami no Soda. Paper Hill. Naruto scrunched his face up, and Iruka nodded. Yeah. It produces a ton of printing presses, amongst other exports, the Chunin said in a business-like manner. A lot of their merchants, along with their shipments, have been going missing. Usually when they head east, towards Konohagakure. They think it's a bandit group, probably not too large, but definitely hidden in the forest. Obito tapped his foot. Anything else? Nothing that you'd like, Iruka said. Come on, some bandits. Naruto said. That sounds perfect. Sasuke agreed monosyllabically, and Obito glanced at Sakura. She tried to look unconcerned, and nodded. Bandits, she could easily handle. A full-grown man without chakra training wasn't much threat to a genin. And besides, Obito Sensei would be there. It sounded like the perfect mission. She'd even get to leave the village. That thought brought a bit of an excited flush to her face, and Obito turned back to Iruka with a grin. All right, he said, extending his hand to accept the mission scroll. Iruka handed it over with a slight, professional smile. We'll take it. Have fun. Iruka's more sardonic side poked through for a moment, but Obito didn't seem to care. He spun back to his charges. All right, it's not quite noon yet, he said with the unmistakable air of command, and his genin snapped to attention. Sakura in particular paid very close attention. Obito almost never talked like this. Kami no Soda is about a day away from here, we'll be leaving the village at 1 o'clock. I want to see you all at the west gate then, bring enough material for 2 days, and whatever other supplies you'll need. Naruto was practically jumping up and down in joy, while Sasuke stoically absorbed their sensei's words. Obito grinned. It'll be like a camping trip. Except there'll probably be horrible-smelling men trying to stab us. Keep that in mind. He tapped 2 fingers to his hitai. See you in an hour and some. And then, he vanished. ####. It took Sakura about 20 minutes to make her way back to her house. When she got there, marched up the stairs to the door, and pushed it open, she found her father tinkering with something at the kitchen table. Hey honey. He called out as she closed the door, not looking up. He was rubbing something that looked like oil into the hinge of the scissor sword he carried into the field with him. He must have recently returned from a mission. He held the weapon up and the blade extended, folding out and adding another half-meter of steel to the sword. Sakura's father nodded with satisfaction, flipping the sword back into its unfolded state, and turned to look at her with a grin that his daughter had always deemed goofy. You're home early. I have a mission, Sakura said, trying and failing not to sound too excited. Oh yeah? That's great honey, her father said distractedly, washing his hands in the sink. Another D rank, I bet. Nope. Sakura said as her father shut the tap off. A C rank. We get to leave the village and everything. Huh. Her father said, turning to meet her. He was still grinning, but it was somehow wider. That's fantastic. Where are you headed? Some little town to the west, Sakura said, walking through the kitchen to reach the stairs going up to her room. Paper Hill. They've had some merchants go missing. Oh yeah. Her father said as her foot came down on the first step. That should be exciting. Your first time out of the village and everything. Sakura said, not really paying attention, and her father chuckled. Well hey, poke me before you leave, K. He said, stretching. I'm pooped. Takubestu Anko's a harsh captain. Sakura blinked, just reaching the top of the stairs. She called back down them as she got to her room. You were on a mission, right? Her father grunted affirmatively. She heard him settle down on the couch and groan, the familiar sound of straining springs warning her that the short green thing was growing closer and closer to its expiration date every day. We were cleaning up some rogue mercenaries. Ever since that dwarf Gato's organization went down, there've been he caught himself, and Sakura giggled. There've been guys who think they're tough wandering up north. They make trouble, we get hired to come and persuade them to not. Doesn't sound so bad, Sakura said loudly, opening her door. I'll be down in a bit to say goodbye. Her father's exaggerated snore answered her, and she closed the door behind her. Now, she muttered to herself, looking around her pristine room, with the exception of one desk where all the messes seemed to end up. What to take? It took her about 15 minutes to get everything together into a small backpack. 2 changes of clothes, a knife sharpener, a bedroll, about 40 kunao, 15 explosive tags, 4 ration packs, a medical kit, some tape, and 5 feet of coiled steel wire. She also managed to shove in a canteen, just in case. She packed it all like a shinobi should, and tested it by throwing the bag 3 feet straight up several times. Nothing rattled or sloshed, and the 4th time she caught it she nodded with satisfaction. She slung it over her back. Not too heavy either. Perfect. Sakura sighed, feeling the weight on her back, and made her way back downstairs. She closed the door quietly, and made her way down the stairs without a sound. If her father was napping, she didn't want to disturb him, even if he'd wanted to say goodbye. He deserved some rest. Kaizashi wasn't napping on the couch though. He was lying there with his eyes closed, but Sakura could tell her father was completely awake. He had his hands folded over a small metal tin on his stomach. Hey! He heard her coming and opened his eyes, despite her having made no noise. Sakura smiled at him, and he grinned back. I made something for you. He lifted the tin. Just something to munch on, and a little besides. I figure you might need it. Thanks Dad, Sakura said, taking the tin respectfully. She secured it in one of the pack's side pockets, and gave her father a peck on the forehead. He closed his eyes again. Have a good time, okay? He said sleepily. And stay safe. It's a wide world out there. I promise, Dad, Sakura smiled. I'll have Obito Sensei with me, anyway. Her father grunted. Oh yeah. He chuckled. You'll be fine. Love you. Love you more. It was nearly dark by the time Team 7 made it to Kami no Soda. They'd met out in front of Konoha's gate and set off, Naruto and Sasuke chattering loudly, and Obito walking with Sakura as she remained mostly silent. The forests around Konoha were beautiful, and the paths through them easy enough to follow. It wasn't a very exciting trip, but Sakura luxuriated in the sounds of birds and other animals all around her, and her teammates' antics. Naruto and Sasuke were funny to watch. Their conversations pinballed between practical considerations and ridiculous fantasies about overly complicated jutsus with too long names. Over the course of the trip, Naruto produced 2 water balloons, and held them in his hand as he walked. The first, he broke on accident when he dropped it after gesticulated wildly towards Sasuke. The second, he eventually lay his other hand over, a concentrated frown falling over his face. Sakura didn't know what he was doing, but it looked like some kind of chakra exercise. When she'd asked Obito, he'd just given her a vague grin and told her it was one of the Yondame's jutsu. The idea that Naruto was working on one of the Hokage's jutsu was both impressive, and slightly depressing. Sakura had stayed a bit quiet after that, even though Obito had done his best to tease conversation out of her about her family, or her shinobi skills. When they reached the town, Sakura's first impression was that it was rather small. She'd lived in Konoha her whole life, buildings stretching as far as the eye could see was the norm for her. This little place, barely more than 3 dozen buildings in a central river, would barely qualify as a neighborhood in the village hidden in the leaves. The sun was almost done setting behind them, and it threw harsh shadows and vibrant red and orange light over the town. The settlement was not, as Sakura had supposed, on top of a hill. This is it, her sensei stated, rather obviously. I never would have guessed, Sasuke muttered, and Naruto laughed. All right, let's head down, their sensei said. We're supposed to meet with a man called Karazen. He'll give us a roof for the night, and point us in the right direction. Sweet. Race you there, Sasuke. Naruto took off with a yell, rushing down the road. Sasuke hesitated for hardly a second before he sprinted after him. Obito watched them go for a moment before snorting. They don't even know where they're going, Sakura said, shifting her backpack. How can they be so confident? They're very sure of themselves, her teacher responded, glancing at her. The coming night made his dark eyes little more than shadows in his face. It's good for some things, but not so much for others. He sighed. For example, the whole town will probably know we're here now. Is that bad? Sakura asked. No, not bad. Well, Obito amended. It could be bad. We'll just have to wait and see. Sakura murmured. She set off after a second, and then realized her teacher wasn't following. She turned to look back at him, and found him considering her thoughtfully. She blinked. What? She tried not to sound worried, but couldn't help just a little leaking out. It felt like she'd done something wrong. She could distantly hear Naruto and Sasuke yelling. Something about cake. You know, Sakura, Obito said, you really remind me of myself sometimes, back when I was a genin. Sakura paled. Why was her sensei bringing this up now? Really? Yeah. Obito sounded almost wistful. I was a hell of a lot louder than you, though, you hardly talked on the way here. Sakura blushed as her teacher continued. But both my teammates were geniuses at what they did. Compared to them, I didn't have much. Sakura frowned. I felt like a loser. The Harino lowered her head, her gut rolling. But, you're Sharingan. Obito snorted. Pfft. These thing. He said, tapping his temple. They've given me a lot more trouble than you'd think, trust me. But, if I'm like you. Sakura lowered her head even further, feeling sick. She could feel the blood rushing through her head. I don't have anything like that. I don't have a bloodline. My dad isn't Hokage. I'm just. You think any of that matters? Obito said kindly. Sakura nodded, just the slight tilt of her head. Her sensei took her step forward and dropped down to one of his knees, bringing his head level with hers. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and Obito smiled. Let me tell you something, Sakura. Naruto's family, or the Sharingan, in regards to being a shinobi, they're just tools. They don't make you intrinsically better than anyone else. But dash. No. Obito's words were harsh, even if his face was not. Everyone has something they're talented at. Those two have just been lucky enough to figure out while they were young. And in a way, it's limited them. Sasuke has focused so much on Uchiha tradition that he's failed to consider what will happen when he fights someone who knows that stuff, like me. And Naruto. He shrugged. His knowledge of seals and Jutsushiki is good for his age. He's got loads of natural talent, and help from his parents. But he's never going to be as good as they are. He just doesn't have the kind of patience for that. His real calling lies somewhere else, I'm sure he'll figure out soon enough. Obito smiled. We'll find your tool, Sakura. I don't know what it is, yet. You've got great chakra control. Maybe you'll be a master of genjutsu, or a world-class medic. You could be a fantastic infiltrator, or you'll work on your ninjutsu and become an efficient powerhouse. Sakura's sensei put his hand on her shoulder, squeezing just slightly. You don't know yet. And that's okay. You're still young, there's no war on, you have plenty of time. Obito stood back up, and Sakura watched him speechlessly. Now come on, he said with a genuine grin. Let's go catch up to those two before they do something stupid. Then he turned, and strode off. Sakura watched his retreating back, stunned. After a moment, she shook her head and went after him. Her head was swimming. She said, not really knowing what she was supposed to say to something like that. Sensei. Obito glanced back at her. Sakura choked. Thanks. Anytime, Obito said. Now come on. I wasn't kidding. I don't want them catching anything on fire. Genin and Jonin made their way into Kami no Soda, and behind them the sun finally set. Check the description for the links to the author.